Part Third, Chapter 8, Part 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part Third, The Lighthouse. Chapter 8, Part 2. Less than 5 minutes after entering the place, the capataz began his retreat. He got away down the stairs with perfect success, gave one upward look over his shoulder at the light on the landing, and ran stealthily across the hall. But at the very moment he was turning out of the great door, with his mind fixed upon escaping the notice of the man upstairs, somebody he had not heard, coming briskly along the front, ran full into him. Both muttered a stifled exclamation of surprise, and leaped back and stood still, each indistinct to the other. Nostromo was silent. The other man spoke first, in an amazed and deadened tone. "Who are you?" Already Nostromo had seemed to recognize Dr. Monygham. He had no doubt now. He hesitated the space of a second. The idea of bolting without a word presented itself to his mind. No use. An inexplicable repugnance to pronounce the name by which he was known kept him silent a little longer. At last he said in a low voice, "A cargador." He walked up to the other. Dr. Monygham had received a shock. He flung his arms up and cried out his wonder aloud, forgetting himself before the marvel of this meeting. Nostromo angrily warned him to moderate his voice. The custom house was not so deserted as it looked. There was somebody in the lighted room above. There is no more evanescent quality in an accomplished fact than its wonderfulness. Solicited incessantly by the considerations affecting its fears and desires, the human mind turns naturally away from the marvelous side of events. And it was in the most natural way possible that the doctor asked this man, whom only 2 minutes before he believed to have been drowned in the gulf, "You have seen somebody up there, have you?" "No, I have not seen him." "Then how do you know?" "I was running away from his shadow when we met." "His shadow?" "Yes, his shadow in the lighted room," said Nostromo in a contemptuous tone. Leaning back with folded arms at the foot of the immense building, he dropped his head, biting his lips slightly, and not looking at the doctor. "Now," he thought to himself, "he will begin asking me about the treasure." But the doctor's thoughts were concerned with an event not as marvellous as Nostromo's appearance, but in itself much less clear. Why had Sotillo taken himself off with his whole command with this suddenness and secrecy? What did this move portend? However, it dawned upon the doctor that the man upstairs was one of the officers left behind by the disappointed colonel to communicate with him. "I believe he is waiting for me," he said. "It is possible." "I must see. Do not go away yet, capataz." "Go away where?" muttered Nostromo. Already the doctor had left him. He remained leaning against the wall, staring at the dark water of the harbour. The shrilling of cicadas filled his ears. An invincible vagueness coming over his thoughts took from them all power to determine his will. "Capataz! Capataz!" The doctor's voice called urgently from above. The sense of betrayal and ruin floated upon his sombre indifference as upon a sluggish sea of pitch. But he stepped out from under the wall, and looking up, saw Dr. Monygham leaning out of the lighted window. "Come up and see what Sotillo has done. You need not fear the man up here." He answered by a slight, bitter laugh. Fear a man! The capataz of the Sulaco cargadores fear a man! It angered him that anybody should suggest such a thing. It angered him to be disarmed and skulking and in danger because of the accursed treasure, which was of so little account to the people who had tied it round his neck. He could not shake off the worry of it. To Nostromo the doctor represented all these people, and he had never even asked after it. Not a word of inquiry about the most desperate undertaking of his life. Thinking these thoughts, Nostromo passed again through the cavernous hall, where the smoke was considerably thinned, and went up the stairs, not so warm to his feet now, towards the streak of light at the top. The doctor appeared in it for a moment, agitated and impatient. "Come up! Come up!" At the moment of crossing the doorway the capataz experienced a shock of surprise. The man had not moved. He saw his shadow in the same place. He started, then stepped in with a feeling of being about to solve a mystery. It was very simple. For an infinitesimal fraction of a second, against the light of 2 flaring and guttering candles, through a blue, pungent, thin haze which made his eyes smart, he saw the man standing as he had imagined him, with his back to the door, casting an enormous and distorted shadow upon the wall. Swifter than a flash of lightning followed the impression of his constrained, toppling attitude, the shoulders projecting forward, the head sunk low upon the breast. Then he distinguished the arms behind his back, and wrenched so terribly that the two clenched fists lashed together had been forced up higher than the shoulder blades. From there his eyes traced in one instantaneous glance the hide rope going upwards from the tied wrists over a heavy beam and down to a staple in the wall. He did not want to look at the rigid legs, at the feet hanging down nervelessly, with their bare toes some 6 inches above the floor, to know that the man had been given the estrapade till he had swooned. His first impulse was to dash forward and sever the rope at one blow. He felt for his knife. He had no knife. Not even a knife. He stood quivering, and the doctor, perched on the edge of the table, faced thoughtfully the cruel and lamentable sight, his chin in his hand, uttered without stirring, "Tortured and shot dead through the breast. Getting cold." This information calmed the capataz. One of the candles flickering in the socket went out. "Who did this?" he asked. "Sotillo, I tell you. Who else? Tortured, of course, but why shot?" The doctor looked fixedly at Nostromo, who shrugged his shoulders slightly. "And Mark shot suddenly, on impulse, it is evident. I wish I had his secret." Nostromo had advanced and stooped slightly to look. "I seem to have seen that face somewhere," he muttered. "Who is he?" The doctor turned his eyes upon him again. "I may yet come to envying his fate. What do you think of that, capataz, eh?" But Nostromo did not even hear these words. Seizing the remaining light, he thrust it under the drooping head. The doctor sat oblivious, with a lost gaze. Then the heavy iron candlestick, as if struck out of Nostromo's hand, clattered on the floor. "Hullo!" exclaimed the doctor, looking up with a start. He could hear the capataz stagger against the table and gasp. In the sudden extinction of the light within, the dead blackness sealing the window frames became alive with stars to his sight. Of course," the doctor muttered to himself in English. "Enough to make him jump out of his skin." Nostromo's heart seemed to force itself into his throat. His head swam. Hirsch! The man was Hirsch! He held on tight to the edge of the table. "But he was hiding in the lighter!" he almost shouted. His voice fell. "In the lighter, and Sotillo brought him in," said the doctor. "He is no more startling to you than you were to me. What I want to know is how he induced some compassionate soul to shoot him." "So Sotillo knows," began Nostromo in a more equable voice. "Everything," interrupted the doctor. The capataz was heard striking the table with his fist. "Everything? What are you saying there? Everything? No everything. It is impossible. Everything?" "Of course. What do you mean by impossible? I tell you I've heard this Hirsch questioned last night, here, in this very room. He knew your name, Decoud's name, and all about the loading of the silver. The lighter was cut in two. He was grovelling in abject terror before Sotillo, but he remembered that much. What do you want more? He knew least about himself. They found him clinging to their anchor. He must have caught at it just as the lighter went to the bottom." "Went to the bottom," repeated Nostromo slowly. "Sotillo believes that. Bueno." The doctor, a little impatiently, was unable to imagine what else could anybody believe. Yes, Sotillo believed that the lighter was sunk, and the capataz de cargadores, together with Martin Decoud, and perhaps one or two other political fugitives, had been drowned. "I told you well, Senor Doctor," remarked Nostromo at that point, "that Sotillo did not know everything." "Eh? What do you mean?" "He did not know I was not dead." "Neither did we." "And you did not care. None of you caballeros on the wharf. Once you got off a man of flesh and blood like yourselves on a fool's business that could not end well. You forget, capataz, I was not on the wharf, and I did not think well of the business. So you need not taunt me. I tell you what, man, we had but little leisure to think of the dead. Death stands near behind us all." "You were gone." "I went, indeed," broke in Nostromo. "And for the sake of what? Tell me." "Ah, that is your own affair," the doctor said roughly. "Do not ask me." Their flowing murmurs paused in the dark. Perched on the edge of the table, with slightly averted faces, they felt their shoulders touch, and their eyes remained directed towards an upright shape nearly lost in the obscurity of the inner part of the room, that with projecting head and shoulders in ghastly immobility seemed intent on catching their every word. "Muy bien," Nostromo muttered at last. "So be it. Teresa was right. It is my own affair." "Teresa is dead," remarked the doctor absently, while his mind followed a new line of thought suggested by what might have been called Nostromo's return to life. "She died, the poor woman." "Without a priest?" the capataz asked, anxiously. "What a question! Who could have got a priest for her last night?" "May God keep her soul!" ejaculated Nostromo, with a gloomy and hopeless fervour which had no time to surprise Dr. Monygham, before, reverting to their previous conversation, he continued in a sinister tone, "Si, senor doctor. As you were saying, it is my own affair. A very desperate affair." "There are no two men in this part of the world that could have saved themselves by swimming as you have done," the doctor said admiringly. And again there was silence between those two men. They were both reflecting, and the diversity of their natures made their thoughts born from their meeting swing afar from each other. The doctor, impelled to risky action by his loyalty to the Goulds, wondered with thankfulness at the chain of accident which had brought that man back where he would be of greatest use in the work of saving the San Tome mine. The doctor was loyal to the mine. It presented itself to his 50-years-old eyes in the shape of a little woman in a soft dress with a long train, with a head attractively overweighted by a great mass of fair hair, and the delicate preciousness of her inner worth partaking of a gem and a flower revealed in every attitude of her person. As the dangers thickened round the San Tome mine this illusion acquired force, permanency, and authority. It claimed him at last. This claim, exalted by a spiritual detachment from the usual sanctions of hope and reward, made Dr. Monygham's thinking, acting individuality extremely dangerous to himself and to others, all his scruples vanishing in the proud feeling that his devotion was the only thing that stood between an admirable woman and a frightful disaster. It was a sort of intoxication which made him utterly indifferent to Decoud's fate, but left his wits perfectly clear for the appreciation of Decoud's political idea. It was a good idea, and Barrios was the only instrument of its realization. The doctor's soul, withered and shrunk by the shame of moral disgrace, became implacable in the expansion of its tenderness. Nostromo's return was providential. He did not think of him humanely, as of a fellow creature just escaped from the jaws of death. The capataz, for him, was the only possible messenger to Cayta. The very man. The doctor's misanthropic mistrust of mankind, the bitterer because based on personal failure, did not lift him sufficiently above common weaknesses. He was under the spell of an established reputation, trumpeted by Captain Mitchell, grown in repetition and fixed in general assent. Nostromo's faithfulness had never been questioned by Dr. Monygham as a fact. It was not likely to be questioned now he stood in desperate need of it himself. Dr. Monygham was human. He accepted the popular conception of the capataz's incorruptibility simply because no word or fact had ever contradicted a mere affirmation. It seemed to be a part of the man, like his whiskers or his teeth. It was impossible to conceive of him otherwise. The question was whether he would consent to go on such a dangerous and desperate errand. The doctor was observant enough to have become aware from the first of something peculiar in the man's temper. He was no doubt sore about the loss of the silver. "It will be necessary to take him into my fullest confidence," he said to himself, with a certain acuteness of insight into the nature he had to deal with. On Nostromo's side the silence had been full of black irresolution, anger, and mistrust. He was the first to break it, however. "The swimming was no great matter," he said. "It is what went before, and what comes after that." He did not quite finish what he meant to say, breaking off short as though his thought had butted against a solid obstacle. The doctor's mind pursued its own schemes with Machiavellian subtlety. He said as sympathetically as he was able, "It is unfortunate, capataz. But no one would think of blaming you. Very unfortunate. To begin with, the treasure ought never to have left the mountain. But it was Decoud who... However, he is dead. There is no need to talk of him." "No," assented Nostromo as the doctor paused. "There is no need to talk of dead men. But I am not dead yet." "You are all right. Only a man of your intrepidity could have saved himself." In this Dr. Monygham was sincere. He esteemed highly the intrepidity of that man, whom he valued but little, being disillusioned as to mankind in general, because of the particular instance in which his own manhood had failed. Having had to encounter single-handed during his period of eclipse many physical dangers, he was well aware of the most dangerous element common to them all, of the crushing, paralyzing sense of human littleness, which is what really defeats a man struggling with natural forces, alone, far from the eyes of his fellows. He was eminently fit to appreciate the mental image he made for himself of the capataz. after hours of tension and anxiety, precipitated suddenly into an abyss of waters and darkness, without earth or sky, and confronting it not only with an undismayed mind, but with sensible success. Of course the man was an incomparable swimmer, that was known, but the doctor judged that this instance testified to a still greater intrepidity of spirit. It was pleasing to him. He augured well from it for the success of the arduous mission with which he meant to entrust the capataz, so marvellously restored to usefulness. And in a tone vaguely gratified, he observed, "It must have been terribly dark." "It was the worst darkness of the Golfo," the capataz assented briefly. He was mollified by what seemed a sign of some faint interest in such things as had befallen him, and dropped a few descriptive phrases with an affected and curt nonchalance. At that moment he felt communicative. He expected the continuance of that interest which, whether accepted or rejected, would have restored to him his personality, the only thing lost in that desperate affair. But the doctor, engrossed by a desperate adventure of his own, was terrible in the pursuit of his idea. He let an exclamation of regret escape him. "I could almost wish you had shouted and shown a light." This unexpected utterance astounded the capataz by its character of cold-blooded atrocity. It was as much as to say, "I wish you had shown yourself a coward. I wish you had had your throat cut for your pains." Naturally he referred it to himself, whereas it related only to the silver, being uttered simply and with many mental reservations. Surprise and rage rendered him speechless, and the doctor pursued, practically unheard by Nostromo, whose stirred blood was beating violently in his ears. "For I am convinced Sotillo, in possession of the silver, would have turned short round and made for some small port abroad. Economically it would have been wasteful, but still less wasteful than having it sunk. It was the next best thing to having it at hand in some safe place and using part of it to buy up Sotillo. But I doubt whether Don Carlos would have ever made up his mind to do it. He is not fit for Costaguana, and that is a fact, capataz." The capataz had mastered the fury that was like a tempest in his ears in time to hear the name of Don Carlos. He seemed to have come out of it a changed man, a man who spoke thoughtfully in a soft and even voice. "And would Don Carlos have been content if I had surrendered this treasure? I should not wonder if they were all of that way of thinking now," the doctor said grimly. "I was never consulted. Decoud had it his own way. Their eyes are opened by this time, I should think. I, for one, know that if silver turned up this moment miraculously ashore, I would give it to Sotillo, and as things stand I would be approved." "Turned up miraculously," repeated the capataz very low, then raised his voice. "That, senor, would be a greater miracle than any saint could perform." "I believe you, capataz," said the doctor dryly. He went on to develop his view of Sotillo's dangerous influence upon the situation, and the capataz, listening as if in a dream, felt himself of as little account as the indistinct, motionless shape of the dead man whom he saw upright under the beam, with his air of listening also, disregarded, forgotten, like a terrible example of neglect. "Was it for an unconsidered and foolish whim that they came to me, then?" he interrupted suddenly. "Had I not done enough for them to be of some account, por Dios? Is it that the hombres finos, the gentlemen, need not think, as long as there is a man of the people ready to risk his body and soul? Or perhaps we have no souls, like dogs." "There was Decoud, too, with his plan," the doctor reminded him again. "Si, and the rich man in San Francisco who had something to do with that treasure, too. What do I know? No, I have heard too many things. It seems to me that everything is permitted to the rich." "I understand, capataz," the doctor began. "What capataz?" broke in Nostromo, in a forcible but even voice. "The capataz is undone, destroyed. There is no capataz. Oh, no, you will find the capataz no more." "Come, this is childish," remonstrated the doctor, and the other calmed down suddenly. "I have been indeed like a little child," he muttered, and as his eyes met again the shape of the murdered man, suspended in his awful immobility, which seemed the uncomplaining immobility of attention, he asked, wondering gently, "Why did Sotillo give the estrapade to this pitiful wretch? Do you know? No torture could have been worse than his fear. Killing, I can understand. His anguish was intolerable to behold. But why should he torment him like this? He could tell no more." No, he could tell nothing more. Any sane man would have seen that. He had told him everything. But I tell you what it is, capataz. Sotillo would not believe what he was told. Not everything. "What is it he would not believe? I cannot understand." "I can, because I have seen the man. He refuses to believe that the treasure is lost." "What?" the capataz cried out in a discomposed tone. "That startles you, eh? Am I to understand, senor," Nostromo went on in a deliberate and, as it were, watchful tone, "that Sotillo thinks the treasure has been saved by some means?" "No, no, that would be impossible," said the doctor, with conviction, and Nostromo emitted a grunt in the dark. "That would be impossible. He thinks that the silver was no longer in the lighter when she was sunk. He has convinced himself that the whole show of getting it away to sea is a mere sham, got up to deceive Gamacho and his nationals, Pedrito Montero, Senor Fuentes, our new Jefe Politico, and himself too. Only, he says, he is no such fool." "But he is devoid of sense. He is the greatest imbecile that ever called himself a colonel in this country of evil," growled Nostromo. "He is no more unreasonable than many sensible men," said the doctor. "He has convinced himself that the treasure can be found because he desires passionately to possess himself of it. And he is also afraid of his officers turning upon him and going over to Pedrito, whom he has not the courage either to fight or trust. Do you see that, capataz? He need fear no desertion as long as some hope remains of that enormous plunder turning up. I have made it my business to keep this very hope up." "You have?" the capataz de cargadores repeated cautiously. "Well, that is wonderful. And how long do you think you are going to keep it up?" "As long as I can." "What does that mean?" "I can tell you exactly. As long as I live," the doctor retorted in a stubborn voice. Then, in a few words, he described the story of his arrest and the circumstances of his release. "I was going back to that silly scoundrel when we met," he concluded. Nostromo had listened with profound attention. "You have made up your mind, then, to a speedy death," he muttered through his clenched teeth. "Perhaps, my illustrious capataz," the doctor said testily, "you are not the only one here who can look an ugly death in the face." "No doubt," mumbled Nostromo loud enough to be overheard. "There may be even more than two fools in this place. Who knows?" "And that is my affair," said the doctor curtly. "As taking out the accursed silver to sea was my affair," retorted Nostromo. "I see. Bueno. Each of us has his reasons. But you were the last man I conversed with before I started, and you talk to me as if I were a fool." Nostromo had a great distaste for the doctor's sardonic treatment of his great reputation. Decoud's faintly ironic recognition used to make him uneasy, but the familiarity of a man like Don Martin was flattering, whereas the doctor was a nobody. He could remember him a penniless outcast, slinking about the streets of Sulaco without a single friend or acquaintance, till Don Carlos Gould took him into the service of the mine. "You may be very wise," he went on thoughtfully, staring into the obscurity of the room pervaded by the gruesome enigma of the tortured and murdered Hirsch. "But I am not such a fool as when I started. I have learned one thing since, and that is that you are a dangerous man." Dr. Monygham was too startled to do more than exclaim, "What is it you say?" "If he could speak, he would say the same thing," pursued Nostromo with a nod of his shadowy head silhouetted against the starlit window. "I do not understand you," said Dr. Monygham faintly. "No? Perhaps if you had not confirmed Sotillo in his madness, he would have been in no haste to give the estrapade to that miserable Hirsch." The doctor started at the suggestion, but his devotion absorbing all his sensibilities had left his heart steeled against remorse and pity. Still, for a complete relief, he felt the necessity of repelling it loudly and contemptuously. "Bah! You dare to tell me that, with a man like Sotillo! I confess I did not give a thought to Hirsch. If I had, it would have been useless. Anybody can see that the luckless wretch was doomed from the moment he caught hold of the anchor. He was doomed, I tell you, just as I myself am doomed, most probably." This is what Dr. Monygham said in answer to Nostromo's remark, which was plausible enough to prick his conscience. He was not a callous man, but the necessity, the magnitude, the importance of the task he had taken upon himself dwarfed all merely humane considerations. He had undertaken it in a fanatical spirit. He did not like it. To lie, to deceive, to circumvent even the basest of mankind was odious to him. It was odious to him by training, instinct, and tradition. To do these things in the character of a traitor was abhorrent to his nature and terrible to his feelings. He had made that sacrifice in a spirit of abasement. He had said to himself bitterly, "I am the one fit for that dirty work." And he believed this. He was not subtle. His simplicity was such that though he had no sort of heroic idea of seeking death, the risk, deadly enough, to which he exposed himself had a sustaining and comforting effect. To that spiritual state the fate of Hirsch presented itself as part of the general atrocity of things. He considered that episode practically. What did it mean? Was it a sign of some dangerous change in Sotillo's delusion? That the man should have been killed like this was what the doctor could not understand. Yes, but why shot? He murmured to himself. Nostromo kept very still. End of chapter 8, part 2. Part 3rd, chapter 9, part 1 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse. Chapter 9, Part 1. Distracted between doubts and hopes, dismayed by the sound of bells pealing out the arrival of Pedrito Montero, Sotillo had spent the morning in battling with his thoughts, a contest to which he was unequal from the vacuity of his mind and the violence of his passions. Disappointment, greed, anger, and fear made a tumult in the colonel's breast louder than the din of bells in the town. Nothing he had planned had come to pass. Neither Sulaco nor the silver of the mine had fallen into his hands. He had performed no military exploit to secure his position, and had obtained no enormous booty to make off with. Pedrito Montero, either as friend or foe, filled him with dread. The sound of bells maddened him. Imagining at first that he might be attacked at once, he had made his battalion stand to arms on the shore. He had walked to and fro all the length of the room, stopping sometimes to gnaw the fingertips of his right hand with a lurid sideways glare fixed on the floor. Then, with a sullen, repelling glance all round, he would resume his tramping in savage aloofness. His hat, horsewhip, sword, and revolver were lying on the table. His officers, crowding the window giving the view of the town gate, disputed amongst themselves the use of his field glass, bought last year on long credit from Manzani. It passed from hand to hand, and the possessor for the time being was besieged by anxious inquiries. "There is nothing to see," he would repeat impatiently. There was nothing, and when the picket in the bushes near the Casa Viola had been ordered to fall back upon the main body, no stir of life appeared on the stretch of dusty and arid land between the town and the waters of the port. But late in the afternoon a horseman issuing from the gate was made out riding up fearlessly. It was an emissary from Senor Fuentes. Being all alone, he was allowed to come on. Dismounting at the great door, he greeted the silent bystanders with cheery impudence, and begged to be taken up at once to the muy valiente colonel. Senor Fuentes, on entering upon his functions of jefe politico, had turned his diplomatic abilities to getting hold of the harbour as well as of the mine. The man he pitched upon to negotiate with Sotillo was a notary public, whom the revolution had found languishing in the common jail on a charge of forging documents. Liberated by the mob, along with the other victims of Blanco tyranny, he had hastened to offer his services to the new government. He set out determined to display much zeal and eloquence in trying to induce Sotillo to come into town alone for a conference with Pedrito Montero. Nothing was further from the colonel's intentions. The mere fleeting idea of trusting himself into the famous Pedrito's hands had made him feel unwell several times. It was out of the question. It was madness. And to put himself in open hostility was madness too. It would render impossible a systematic search for that treasure, for that wealth of silver which he seemed to feel somewhere about, to scent somewhere near. But where? Where? Heavens, where? Oh, why had he allowed that doctor to go, imbecile that he was? But no, it was the only right course, he reflected distractedly, while the messenger waited downstairs, chatting agreeably to the officers. It was in that scoundrelly doctor's true interest to return with positive information. But what if anything stopped him? A general prohibition to leave the town, for instance. There would be patrols. The colonel, seizing his head in his hands, turned in his tracks as if struck with vertigo. A flash of craven inspiration suggested to him an expedient not unknown to European statesmen when they wished to delay a difficult negotiation. Booted and spurred, he scrambled into the hammock with undignified haste. His handsome face had turned yellow with the strain of weighty cares. The ridge of his shapely nose had grown sharp. The audacious nostrils appeared mean and pinched. The velvety, caressing glance of his fine eyes seemed dead and even decomposed. For these almond-shaped, languishing orbs had become inappropriately bloodshot with much sinister sleeplessness. He addressed the surprised envoy of Senor Fuentes in a deadened, exhausted voice. It came pathetically feeble from under a pile of ponchos, which buried his elegant person right up to the black moustaches, uncurled, pendant, in sign of bodily prostration and mental incapacity. Fever. Fever, a heavy fever, had overtaken the muy valiente colonel. A wavering wildness of expression, caused by the passing spasms of slight colic, which had declared itself suddenly, and the rattling teeth of repressed panic, had a genuineness which impressed the envoy. It was a cold fit. The colonel explained that he was unable to think, to listen, to speak. With an appearance of superhuman effort the colonel gasped out that he was not in a state to return a suitable reply or to execute any of his Excellency's orders. But tomorrow, tomorrow, let his Excellency Don Pedro be without uneasiness. The brave Esmeralda regiment held the harbour. Held. And closing his eyes, he rolled his aching head like a half-delirious invalid under the inquisitive stare of the envoy, who was obliged to bend down over the hammock in order to catch the painful and broken accents. Meantime, Colonel Sotillo trusted that his Excellency's humanity would permit the doctor, the English doctor, to come out of town with his case of foreign remedies to attend upon him. He begged anxiously his worship, the caballero now present, for the grace of looking in as he passed the Casa Gould, and informing the English doctor, who was probably there, that his services were immediately required by Colonel Sotillo, lying ill of the fever in the custom house. Immediately, most urgently required, awaited with extreme impatience. 1,000 thanks. He closed his eyes wearily and would not open them again, lying perfectly still, deaf, dumb, insensible, overcome, vanquished, crushed, annihilated by the fell disease. But as soon as the doctor had shut after him the door of the landing, the colonel leaped out with a fling of both feet in an avalanche of woolen coverings. His spurs having become entangled in a perfect welter of ponchos, he nearly pitched on his head, and did not recover his balance till the middle of the room. Concealed behind the half-closed jalousies, he listened to what went on below. The envoy had already mounted, and turning to the morose officers occupying the great doorway, took off his hat formally. "Caballeros," he said, in a very loud tone, "allow me to recommend you to take care of your colonel. It has done me much honour and gratification to have seen you all, a fine body of men, exercising the soldierly virtue of patience in this exposed situation, where there is much sun and no water to speak of, while a town full of wine and feminine charms is ready to embrace you for the brave men you are. Caballeros, I have the honour to salute you. There will be much dancing tonight in Sulaco. Goodbye." But he reined in his horse and inclined his head sideways on seeing the old major step out, very tall and meagre, in a straight narrow coat coming down to his ankles, as it were the casing of the regimental colours rolled round their staff. The intelligent old warrior, after enunciating in a dogmatic tone the general proposition that the world was full of traitors, went on pronouncing deliberately a panegyric upon Sotillo. He ascribed to him with leisurely emphasis every virtue under heaven, summing it all up in an absurd colloquialism current amongst the lower class of Occidentals, especially about Esmeralda. And, he concluded, with a sudden rise in the voice, a man of many teeth. Hombre de muchos dientes. Si, senor. As to us, he pursued, portentous and impressive, your worship is beholding the finest body of officers in the Republic, men unequalled for valour and sagacity, y hombres de muchos dientes. "What, all of them?" inquired the disreputable envoy of Senor Fuentes, with a faint derisive smile. "Todos, si, senor," the major affirmed gravely, with conviction. "Men of many teeth." The other wheeled his horse to face the portal resembling the high gate of a dismal barn. He raised himself in his stirrups, extended one arm. He was a facetious scoundrel, entertaining for these stupid Occidentals a feeling of great scorn natural in a native from the central provinces. The folly of Esmeraldians especially aroused his amused contempt. He began an oration upon Pedro Montero, keeping a solemn countenance. He flourished his hand as if introducing him to their notice. And when he saw every face set, all the eyes fixed upon his lips, he began to shout a sort of catalogue of perfections. "Generous, valorous, affable, profound," he snatched off his hat enthusiastically. "A statesman, an invincible chief of partisans." He dropped his voice startlingly to a deep, hollow note. "And a dentist." He was off instantly at a smart walk, the rigid straddle of his legs, the turned-out feet, the stiff back, the rakish slant of the sombrero above the square, motionless set of the shoulders, expressing an infinite, awe-inspiring impudence. Upstairs, behind the jalousies, Sotillo did not move for a long time. The audacity of the fellow appalled him. What were his officers saying below? They were saying nothing. Complete silence. He quaked. It was not thus that he had imagined himself at that state of the expedition. He had seen himself triumphant, unquestioned, appeased. the idol of the soldiers, weighing in secret complacency the agreeable alternatives of power and wealth open to his choice. Alas, how different! Distracted, restless, supine, burning with fury or frozen with terror, he felt a dread as fathomless as the sea creep upon him from every side. That rogue of a doctor had to come out with his information. That was clear. It would be of no use to him alone. He could do nothing with it. Malediction! The doctor would never come out. He was probably under arrest already, shut up together with Don Carlos. He laughed aloud insanely. Ha 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 ha! It was Pedrito Montero who would get the information. Ha 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 ha! And the silver. Ha! All at once, in the midst of the laugh, he became motionless and silent, as if turned to stone. He too had a prisoner who must know the real truth. He would have to be made to speak. And Sotillo, who all that time had not quite forgotten Hirsch, felt an inexplicable reluctance at the notion of proceeding to extremities. He felt a reluctance, part of that unfathomable dread that crept on all sides upon him. He remembered reluctantly, too, the dilated eyes of the hide merchant, his contortions, his loud sobs and protestations. It was not compassion or even mere nervous sensibility. The fact was that Sotillo did never for a moment believe his story. He could not believe it. Nobody could believe such nonsense. Yet those accents of despairing truth impressed him disagreeably. They made him feel sick, and he suspected also that the man might have gone mad with fear. A lunatic is a hopeless subject. Bah! A pretense. Nothing but a pretense. He would know how to deal with that. He was working himself up to the right pitch of ferocity. His fine eyes squinted slightly. He clapped his hands. A barefooted orderly appeared noiselessly, a corporal, with his bayonet hanging on his thigh and a stick in his hand. The colonel gave his orders, and presently the miserable Hirsch, pushed in by several soldiers, found him frowning awfully in a broad armchair, hat on head, knees wide apart, arms akimbo, masterful, imposing, irresistible, haughty, sublime, terrible. Hirsch, with his arms tied behind his back, had been bundled violently into one of the smaller rooms. For many hours he remained apparently forgotten, stretched lifelessly on the floor. From that solitude, full of despair and terror, he was torn out brutally with kicks and blows, passive, sunk in hebetude. He listened to threats and admonitions, and afterwards made his usual answers to questions, with his chin sunk on his breast, his hands tied behind his back, swaying a little in front of Sotillo, and never looking up. When he was forced to hold up his head by means of a bayonet point prodding him under the chin, his eyes had a vacant, trance-like stare, and drops of perspiration as big as peas were seen hailing down the dirt, bruises, and scratches of his white face. Then they stopped suddenly. Sotillo looked at him in silence. "Will you depart from your obstinacy, you rogue?" he asked. Already a rope whose one end was fastened to Senor Hirsch's wrists had been thrown over a beam, and 3 soldiers held the other end, waiting. He made no answer. His heavy lower lip hung stupidly. Sotillo made a sign. Hirsch was jerked up off his feet, and a yell of despair and agony burst out in the room, filled the passage of the great buildings, rent the air outside, caused every soldier of the camp along the shore to look up at the windows, started some of the officers in the hall, babbling excitedly with shining eyes. Others, setting their lips, looked gloomily at the floor. Sotillo, followed by the soldiers, had left the room. The sentry on the landing presented arms. Hirsch went on screaming, all alone behind the half-closed jalousies, while the sunshine, reflected from the water of the harbour, made an ever-running ripple of light high up on the wall. He screamed with uplifted eyebrows and a wide-open mouth, incredibly wide, black, enormous, full of teeth, comical. In the still burning air of the windless afternoon he made the waves of his agony travel as far as the O.S.N. Company's offices. Captain Mitchell, on the balcony, trying to make out what went on generally, had heard him faintly but distinctly, and the feeble and appalling sound lingered in his ears after he had retreated indoors with blanched cheeks. He had been driven off the balcony several times during that afternoon. Sotillo, irritable, moody, walked restlessly about, held consultations with his officers, gave contradictory orders in this shrill clamour pervading the whole empty edifice. Sometimes there would be long and awful silences. Several times he had entered the torture chamber where his sword, horsewhip, revolver, and field-glass were lying on the table to ask with forced calmness, "Will you speak the truth now?" "No." "I can wait." But he could not afford to wait much longer. That was just it. Every time he went in and came out with a slam of the door, the sentry on the landing presented arms and got in return a black, venomous, unsteady glance, which in reality saw nothing at all, being merely the reflection of the soul within, a soul of gloomy hatred, irresolution, avarice, and fury. The sun had set when he went in once more. A soldier carried in 2 lighted candles and slunk out, shutting the door without noise. "Speak, thou Jewish child of the devil! The silver! The silver, I say! Where is it? Where have you foreign rogues hidden it? Confess, or—" A slight quiver passed up the taut rope from the racked limbs, but the body of Senor Hirsch, enterprising business man from Esmeralda, hung under the heavy beam, perpendicular and silent, facing the colonel awfully. The inflow of the night air, cooled by the snows of the Sierra, spread gradually a delicious freshness through the close heat of the room. "Speak, thief, scoundrel, picaro, or—" Sotillo had seized the riding whip and stood with his arm lifted up. For a word, for one little word, he felt he would have knelt, cringed, grovelled on the floor before the drowsy, conscious stare of those fixed eyeballs starting out of the grimy, dishevelled head that drooped very still with its mouth closed askew. The colonel ground his teeth with rage and struck. The rope vibrated leisurely to the blow, like the long string of a pendulum starting from a rest, but no swinging motion was imparted to the body of Senor Hirsch, the well-known hide merchant on the coast. With a convulsive effort of the twisted arms it leaped up a few inches, curling upon itself like a fish on the end of a line. Senor Hirsch's head was flung back on his straining throat. His chin trembled. For a moment the rattle of his chattering teeth pervaded the vast shadowy room, where the candles made a patch of light round the 2 flames burning side by side. And as Sotillo, staying his raised hand, waited for him to speak, with the sudden flash of a grin and straining forward of the wrenched shoulders, he spat violently into his face. The uplifted whip fell, and the colonel sprang back with a low cry of dismay, as if aspersed by a jet of deadly venom. Quick as thought he snatched up his revolver and fired twice. The report and the concussion of the shots seemed to throw him at once from ungovernable rage into idiotic stupor. He stood with drooping jaw and stony eyes. What had he done? Sangre de Dios! What had he done? What had he done? He was basely appalled at his impulsive act, sealing forever these lips from which so much was to be extorted. What could he say? How could he explain? Ideas of headlong flight somewhere, anywhere, passed through his mind. Even the craven and absurd notion of hiding under the table occurred to his cowardice. It was too late. His officers had rushed in tumultuously, in a great clatter of scabbards, clamouring with astonishment and wonder. But since they did not immediately proceed to plunge their swords into his breast, the brazen side of his character asserted itself. Passing the sleeve of his uniform over his face, he pulled himself together. His truculent glance turned slowly here and there, checked the noise where it fell, and the stiff body of the late Senor Hirsch, merchant, after swaying imperceptibly, made a half turn, and came to a rest in the midst of awed murmurs and uneasy shuffling. A voice remarked loudly, "Behold a man who will never speak again!" And another from the back row of faces, timid and pressing, cried out, "Why did you kill him, mi colonel?" "Because he has confessed everything," answered Sotillo, with the hardihood of desperation. He felt himself cornered. He brazened it out on the strength of his reputation with very fair success. His hearers thought him very capable of such an act. They were disposed to believe his flattering tale. There is no credulity so eager and blind as the credulity of covetousness, which, in its universal extent, measures the moral misery and the intellectual destitution of mankind. Ah, he had confessed everything. This fractious Jew, this bribon. Good. Then he was no longer wanted. A sudden dense guffaw was heard from the senior captain, a big-headed man with little round eyes and monstrously fat cheeks which never moved. The old major, tall and fantastically ragged like a scarecrow, walked round the body of the late Senor Hirsch, muttering to himself with ineffable complacency that, like this, there was no need to guard against any future treacheries of that scoundrel. The others stared, shifting from foot to foot, and whispering short remarks to each other. Sotillo buckled on his sword and gave curt, peremptory orders to hasten the retirement decided upon in the afternoon. Sinister, impressive, his sombrero pulled right down upon his eyes, he marched first through the door in such disorder of mind that he forgot utterly to provide for Dr. Monygham's possible return. As the officers trooped out after him, one or two looked back hastily at the late Senor Hirsch, merchant from Esmeralda, left swinging rigidly at rest, alone with the 2 burning candles. In the emptiness of the room, the burly shadow of head and shoulders on the wall had an air of life. below the troops fell in silently and moved off by companies without drum or trumpet. The old scarecrow major commanded the rear guard, but the party he left behind, with orders to fire the custom house and burn the carcass of the treacherous Jew where it hung, failed somehow in their haste to set the staircase properly alight. The body of the late Senor Hirsch dwelt alone for a time in the dismal solitude of the unfinished building, resounding weirdly with sudden slams and clicks of doors and latches, with rustling scurries of torn papers, and the tremulous sighs that at each gust of wind passed under the high roof. The light of the two candles burning before the perpendicular and breathless immobility of the late Senor Hirsch threw a gleam afar over land and water, like a signal in the night. He remained to startle Nostromo by his presence and to puzzle Dr. Monygham by the mystery of his atrocious end. "But why shot?" the doctor again asked himself, audibly. This time he was answered by a dry laugh from Nostromo. "You seem much concerned at a very natural thing, Senor Doctor. I wonder why. It is very likely that before long we shall all get shot one after another, if not by Sotillo, then by Pedrito, or Fuentes, or Gamacho. And we may even get the estrapade, too. Or worse, quien sabe, with your pretty tale of the silver you put into Sotillo's head." "It was in his head already," the doctor protested. "I only—" "Yes, and you only nailed it there so that the devil himself—" "That is precisely what I meant to do," caught up the doctor. "That is what you meant to do. Bueno. It is as I say. You are a dangerous man." Their voices, which without rising had been growing quarrelsome, ceased suddenly. The late Senor Hirsch, erect and shadowy against the stars, seemed to be waiting, attentive, in impartial silence. But Dr. Monygham had no mind to quarrel with Nostromo. At this supremely critical point of Sulaco's fortunes it was borne upon him at last that this man was really indispensable, more indispensable than ever the infatuation of Captain Mitchell, his proud discoverer, could conceive. Far beyond what Decoud's best dry raillery about my illustrious friend, the unique capataz de cargadores, had ever intended. The fellow was unique. He was not one in 1,000. He was absolutely the only one. The doctor surrendered. There was something in the genius of that Genoese seaman which dominated the destinies of great enterprises and of many people, the fortunes of Charles Gould, the fate of an admirable woman. At this last thought the doctor had to clear his throat before he could speak. In a completely changed tone he pointed out to the capataz that, to begin with, he personally ran no great risk. As far as everybody knew, he was dead. It was an enormous advantage. He had only to keep out of sight in the Casa Viola, where the old Garibaldino was known to be alone, with his dead wife. The servants had all run away. No one would think of searching for him there, or anywhere else on earth, for that matter. "That would be very true," Nostromo spoke up bitterly, "if I had not met you." For a time the doctor kept silent. "Do you mean to say that you think I may give you away?" he asked in an unsteady voice. "Why? Why should I do that?" "What do I know? Why not? To gain a day, perhaps. It would take Sotillo a day to give me the estrapade, and try some things, perhaps, before he puts a bullet through my heart, as he did to that poor wretch here. Why not?" The doctor swallowed with difficulty. His throat had gone dry in a moment. It was not from indignation. The doctor, pathetically enough, believed that he had forfeited the right to be indignant with anyone for anything. It was simple dread. Had the fellow heard his story by some chance? If so, there was an end of his usefulness in that direction. The indispensable man escaped his influence because of that indelible blot which made him fit for dirty work. A feeling as of sickness came upon the doctor. He would have given anything to know, but he dared not clear up the point. The fanaticism of his devotion, fed on the sense of his abasement, hardened his heart in sadness and scorn. "Why not, indeed?" he re-echoed sardonically. "Then the safe thing for you to do is kill me on the spot. I would defend myself, but you may just as well know I am going about unarmed." "Por Dios!" said the capataz passionately. "You fine people are all alike. All dangerous. All betrayers of the poor who are your dogs." "You do not understand," began the doctor slowly. "I understand you all," cried the other with a violent movement, as shadowy to the doctor's eyes as the persistent immobility of the late Senor Hirsch. "A poor man amongst you has got to look after himself. I say that you do not care for those that serve you. Look at me. After all these years, suddenly here I find myself like one of these curs that barks outside the walls, without a kennel or dry bone for my teeth. Caramba!" But he relented with a contemptuous fairness. "Of course," he went on quietly, "I do not suppose that you would hasten to give me up to Sotillo, for example. It is not that. It is that I am nothing.
Suddenly he swung his arm downwards. "Nothing to anyone," he repeated. The doctor breathed freely. "Listen, capataz," he said, stretching out his arm almost affectionately towards Nostromo's shoulder. "I am going to tell you a very simple thing. You are safe because you are needed. I would not give you away for any conceivable reason, because I want you." In the dark Nostromo bit his lip. He had heard enough of that. He knew what that meant. No more of that for him. But he had to look after himself now, he thought. And he thought, too, that it would not be prudent to part in anger from his companion. The doctor, admitted to be a great healer, had amongst the populace of Sulaco the reputation of being an evil sort of man. It was based solidly on his personal appearance, which was strange, and on his rough, ironic manner, proofs visible, sensible, and incontrovertible of the doctor's malevolent disposition. And Nostromo was of the people. So he only grunted incredulously. "You, to speak plainly, are the only man," the doctor pursued. "It is in your power to save this town and everybody from the destructive rapacity of men who—" "No, senor," said Nostromo sullenly. "It is not in my power to get the treasure back for you to give up to Sotillo, or Pedrito, or Gamacho. What do I know?" "Nobody expects the impossible," was the answer. "You have said it yourself. Nobody," muttered Nostromo in a gloomy, threatening tone. But Dr. Monygham, full of hope, disregarded the enigmatic words and the threatening tone. To their eyes, accustomed to obscurity, the late Senor Hirsch, growing more distinct, seemed to have come nearer, and the doctor lowered his voice in exposing his scheme as though afraid of being overheard. He was taking the indispensable man into his fullest confidence. Its implied flattery and suggestion of great risks came with a familiar sound to the capataz. His mind, floating in irresolution and discontent, recognized it with bitterness. He understood well that the doctor was anxious to save the San Tome mine from annihilation. He would be nothing without it. It was his interest, just as it had been the interest of Senor Decoud, of the Blancos, and of the Europeans to get his cargadores on their side. His thought became arrested upon Decoud. What would happen to him? End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Third, Chapter 9, Part 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse. Chapter 9, Part 2. Nostromo's prolonged silence made the doctor uneasy. He pointed out quite unnecessarily that though for the present he was safe, he could not live concealed forever. The choice was between accepting the mission to Barrios with all its dangers and difficulties, and leaving Sulaco by stealth, ingloriously in poverty. "None of your friends could reward you and protect you just now, capataz. Not even Don Carlos himself. I would have none of your protection and none of your rewards. I only wish I could trust your courage and your sense. When I return in triumph, as you say, with Barrios, I may find you all destroyed. You have the knife at your throat now." It was the doctor's turn to remain silent in the contemplation of horrible contingencies. "Well, we would trust your courage and your sense. And you, too, have a knife at your throat. Ah, and whom am I to thank for that? What are your politics and your mines to me, your silver and your constitutions, your Don Carlos this and Don Jose that?" "I don't know," burst out the exasperated doctor. "There are innocent people in danger whose little finger is worth more than you or I and all the Ribieras together." "I don't know." "You should have asked yourself before you allowed Decoud to lead you into all this. It was your place to think like a man, but if you did not think then, try to act like a man now. Did you imagine Decoud cared very much for what would happen to you?" "No more than you care what will happen to me," muttered the other. "No, I care for what will happen to you as little as I care for what will happen to myself." "And all this because you are such a devoted Ribierist," Nostromo said in an incredulous tone. "All this because I am such a devoted Ribierist," repeated Dr. Monygham grimly. Again Nostromo, gazing abstractedly at the body of the late Senor Hirsch, remained silent, thinking that the doctor was a dangerous person in more than one sense. It was impossible to trust him. "Do you speak in the name of Don Carlos?" he asked at last. "Yes, I do," the doctor said loudly, without hesitation. "He must come forward now. He must," he added in a mutter which Nostromo did not catch. "What did you say, senor?" The doctor started. I say that you must be true to yourself, capataz. It would be worse than folly to fail now." "True to myself," repeated Nostromo. "How do you know that I would not be true to myself if I told you to go to the devil with your propositions?" "I do not know. Maybe you would," the doctor said, with a roughness of tone intended to hide the sinking of his heart and the faltering of his voice. "All I know is that you had better get away from here. Some of Sotillo's men may turn up here looking for me." He slipped off the table, listening intently. The capataz, too, stood up. "Suppose I went to Cayta, what would you do meantime?" he asked. "I would go to Sotillo directly you had left, in the way I am thinking of." "A very good way, if only that engineer in chief consents. Remind him, senor, that I looked after the old rich Englishman who pays for the railway, and that I saved the lives of some of his people that time when a gang of thieves came from the south to wreck one of his pay trains. It was I who discovered it, all at the risk of my life, by pretending to enter into their plans. Just as you are doing with Sotillo." "Yes, yes, of course. But I can offer him better arguments," the doctor said hastily. "Leave it to me." "Ah, yes, true. I am nothing." "Not at all. You are everything." They moved a few paces towards the door. Behind them the late Senor Hirsch preserved the immobility of a disregarded man. "That will be all right. I know what to say to the engineer," pursued the doctor in a low tone. "My difficulty will be with Sotillo." And Dr. Monygham stopped short in the doorway, as if intimidated by the difficulty. He had made the sacrifice of his life. He considered this a fitting opportunity. But he did not want to throw his life away too soon. In his quality of betrayer of Don Carlos' confidence, he would have ultimately to indicate the hiding place of the treasure. That would be the end of his deception, and the end of himself as well, at the hands of the infuriated colonel. He wanted to delay him to the very last moment, and he had been racking his brains to invent some place of concealment at once plausible and difficult of access. He imparted his trouble to Nostromo and concluded, "Do you know what, capataz? I think that when the time comes, and some information must be given, I shall indicate the Great Isabel. That is the best place I can think of. What is the matter?" A low exclamation had escaped Nostromo. The doctor waited, surprised, and after a moment of profound silence heard a thick voice stammer out, "Utter folly," and stop with a gasp. "Why folly?" "Ah, you do not see it," began Nostromo scathingly, gathering scorn as he went on. 3 men in a half hour would see that no ground had been disturbed anywhere on that island. Do you think that such a treasure can be buried without leaving traces of the work? Eh, senor doctor? Why, you would not gain half a day before having your throat cut by Sotillo. The Isabel! What stupidity! What miserable invention! Ah, you are all alike, you fine men of intelligence. All you are fit for is to betray men of the people into undertaking deadly risks for objects that you are not even sure about. If it comes off, you get the benefit. If not, then it does not matter. He is only a dog. Ah, Madre de Dios! I would... He shook his fists above his head. The doctor was overwhelmed at first by this fierce, hissing vehemence. "Well, it seems to me on your own showing that the men of the people are no mean fools, too," he said sullenly. "No, but come, you are so clever. Have you a better place?" Nostromo had calmed down as quickly as he had flared up. "I am clever enough for that," he said quietly, almost with indifference. "You want to tell him of a hiding place big enough to take days in ransacking, a place where treasure of silver ingots can be buried without leaving a sign on the surface." "And close at hand," the doctor put in. "Just so, senor. Tell him it is sunk." "This has the merit of being the truth," the doctor said contemptuously. "He will not believe it. You tell him that it is sunk where he may hope to lay his hands on it, and he will believe you quick enough. Tell him it has been sunk in the harbour in order to be recovered afterwards by divers. Tell him you found out that I had orders from Don Carlos Gould to lower the cases quietly overboard somewhere in a line between the end of the jetty and the entrance. The depth is not too great there. He has no divers, but he has a ship, boats, ropes, chains, sailors, of a sort. Let him fish for the silver. Let him set his fools to drag backwards and forwards and crossways while he sits and watches till his eyes drop out of his head." "Really, this is an admirable idea," muttered the doctor. "See, you tell him that, and see whether he would not believe you. He will spend days in rage and torment, and still he will believe. He will have no thought for anything else. He will not give up till he is driven off. Why, he may even forget to kill you. He will neither eat nor sleep. He... The very thing! The very thing!" The doctor repeated in an excited whisper, "Capataz, I begin to believe that you are a great genius in your own way." Nostromo had paused, then began again in a changed tone. sombre, speaking to himself as though he had forgotten the doctor's existence. "There is something in a treasure that fastens upon a man's mind. He will pray and blaspheme, and still persevere, and will curse the day he ever heard of it, and will let his last hour come upon him unawares, still believing that he missed it only by a foot. He will see it every time he closes his eyes. He will never forget it till he is dead. And even then, doctor, did you ever hear of the miserable gringos on Azuera that cannot die? Sailors like myself. There is no getting away from a treasure that once fastens upon your mind. You are a devil of a man, capataz. It is the most plausible thing." Nostromo pressed his arm. "It will be worse for him than thirst at sea or hunger in a town full of people. Do you know what that is? He shall suffer greater torments than he inflicted upon that terrified wretch who had no invention. None. Not like me. I could have told Sotillo a deadly tale for very little pain." He laughed wildly, and turned in the doorway towards the body of the late Senor Hirsch, an opaque, long blotch in the semi-transparent obscurity of the room between the two tall parallelograms of the windows full of stars. "You man of fear!" he cried. "You shall be avenged by me, Nostromo. Out of my way, doctor. Stand aside, or by the suffering soul of a woman dead without confession, I will strangle you with my 2 hands." He bounded downwards into the black smoky hall. With a grunt of astonishment, Dr. Monygham threw himself recklessly into the pursuit. At the bottom of the charred stairs he had a fall, pitching forward on his face with a force that would have stunned a spirit less intent upon a task of love and devotion. He was up in a moment, jarred, shaken, with a queer impression of the terrestrial globe having been flung at his head in the dark. But it wanted more than that to stop Dr. Monygham's body. Possessed by the exaltation of self-sacrifice, a reasonable exaltation, determined not to lose whatever advantage chance put into his way, he ran with headlong, tottering swiftness, his arms going like a windmill in his effort to keep his balance on his crippled feet. He lost his hat. The tails of his open gabardine flew behind him. He had no mind to lose sight of the indispensable man, but it was a long time and a long way from the custom house before he managed to seize his arm from behind, roughly, out of breath. "Stop! Are you mad?" Already Nostromo was walking slowly, his head dropping, as if checked in his pace by the weariness of irresolution. "What is that to you? Ah, I forgot. You want me for something. Always. Siempre, Nostromo." "What do you mean by talking of strangling me?" panted the doctor. "What do I mean? I mean that the king of the devils himself has sent you out of this town of cowards and talkers to meet me tonight of all the nights of my life." Under the starry sky the Albergo d'Italia Una emerged black and low, breaking the dark level of the plain. Nostromo stopped altogether. "The priests say he is a tempter, do they not?" he added through his clenched teeth. "My good man, you drivel. The devil has nothing to do with this. Neither has the town, which you may call by what name you please. But Don Carlos Gould is neither a coward nor an empty talker. You will admit that." He waited. "Well?" "Could I see Don Carlos?" "Great heavens, no!" "Why? What for?" exclaimed the doctor in agitation. "I tell you it is madness. I will not let you go into the town for anything." "I must." "You must not," hissed the doctor, fiercely, almost beside himself with the fear of the man doing away with his usefulness for an imbecile whim of some sort. "I tell you, you shall not. I would rather—" He stopped, at a loss for words, feeling fagged out, powerless, holding on to Nostromo's sleeve absolutely for support after his run. "I am betrayed," muttered the capataz to himself, and the doctor, who overheard the last word, made an effort to speak calmly. "That is exactly what would happen to you. You would be betrayed." He thought with a sickening dread that the man was so well known that he could not escape recognition. The house of the Senor Administrador was beset by spies, no doubt, and even the very servants of the casa were not to be trusted. "Reflect, capataz," he said impressively. "What are you laughing at?" "I am laughing to think that if somebody that did not approve of my presence in town, for instance, you understand, senor doctor, if somebody were to give me up to Pedrito, it would not be beyond my power to make friends even with him. It is true. What do you think of that?" "You are a man of infinite resource, capataz," said Dr. Monygham dismally. "I recognize that. But the town is full of talk about you, and those few cargadores that are not in hiding with the railway people have been shouting 'Viva Montero' on the plaza all day." "My poor cargadores," muttered Nostromo. "Betrayed. Betrayed." I understand that on the wharf you were pretty free in laying about you with a stick amongst your poor cargadores, the doctor said in a grim tone, which showed that he was recovering from his exertions. Make no mistake, Pedrito is furious at Senor Ribiera's rescue, and at having lost the pleasure of shooting Decoud. Already there are rumours in the town of the treasure having been spirited away. To have missed that does not please Pedrito either. But let me tell you that if you had all that silver in your hand for ransom, it would not save you. Turning swiftly and catching the doctor by the shoulders, Nostromo thrust his face close to his. Maladetta! You follow me, speaking of the treasure. You have sworn my ruin. You were the last man who looked upon me before I went out with it. And Sidoni, the engine driver, says you have an evil eye. He ought to know. I saved his broken leg for him last year, the doctor said stoically. He felt on his shoulders the weight of these hands famed among the populace for snapping thick ropes and bending horseshoes. And to you I offer the best means of saving yourself. Let me go, and of retrieving your great reputation. You boasted of making the capataz de cargadores famous from one end of America to the other about this wretched silver. But I bring you a better opportunity. Let me go, hombre. Nostromo released him abruptly, and the doctor feared that the indispensable man would run off again. But he did not. He walked on slowly. The doctor hobbled by his side, till within a stone's throw from the Casa Viola. Nostromo stopped again. Silent in inhospitable darkness, the Casa Viola seemed to have changed its nature. His home appeared to repel him with an air of hopeless and inimical mystery. The doctor said, "You'll be safe there. Go in, capataz." "How can I go in?" Nostromo seemed to ask himself in a low, inward tone. "She cannot unsay what she said, and I cannot undo what I have done. I tell you it is all right. Viola is all alone in there. I looked in as I came out of the town. You will be perfectly safe in that house till you leave it to make your name famous on the Campo. I am going now to arrange for your departure with the engineer in chief, and I shall bring you news here long before daybreak." Dr. Monygham, disregarding, perhaps fearing to penetrate the meaning of Nostromo's silence, clapped him lightly on the shoulder, and starting off with his smart, lame walk, vanished utterly at the third or fourth hop in the direction of the railway track. Arrested between the two wooden posts for people to fasten their horses to, Nostromo did not move, as if he too had been planted solidly in the ground. At the end of half an hour he lifted his head to the deep baying of the dogs at the railway yards, which had burst out suddenly, tumultuous and deadened as if coming from under the plain. That lame doctor with the evil eye had got there pretty fast. Step by step Nostromo approached the Albergo d'Italia Una, which he had never known so lightless, so silent before. The door, all black in the pale wall, stood open as he left it 24 hours before, when he had nothing to hide from the world. He remained before it, irresolute, like a fugitive, like a man betrayed. Poverty, misery, starvation. Where had he heard these words? The anger of a dying woman had prophesied that fate for his folly. It looked as if it would come true very quickly, and the leperos would laugh, she had said. Yes, they would laugh if they knew that the capataz de cargadores was at the mercy of the mad doctor whom they could remember only a few years ago buying cooked food from a stall on the plaza for a copper coin, like one of themselves. At that moment the notion of seeking Captain Mitchell passed through his mind. He glanced in the direction of the jetty and saw a small gleam of light in the O.S.N. Company's building. The thought of the lighted windows was not attractive. 2 lighted windows had decoyed him into the empty custom house, only to fall into the clutches of that doctor. No, he would not go near lighted windows again on that night. Captain Mitchell was there, and what could he be told? That doctor would worm it all out of him as if he were a child. On the threshold he called out, "Giorgio!" in an undertone. Nobody answered. He stepped in. "Hola, viejo! Are you there?" In the impenetrable darkness his head swam with the illusion that the obscurity of the kitchen was as vast as the Placid Gulf, and that the floor dipped forward like a sinking lighter. "Hola, viejo!" he repeated falteringly, swaying where he stood. His hand, extended to steady himself, fell upon the table. Moving a step forward, he shifted it and felt a box of matches under his fingers. He fancied he had heard a quiet sigh. He listened for a moment, holding his breath, then with trembling hands tried to strike a light. The tiny piece of wood flamed up quite blindingly at the end of his fingers, raised above his blinking eyes. A concentrated glare fell upon the leonine white head of old Giorgio against the black fireplace, showed him leaning forward in a chair in staring immobility, surrounded, overhung by great masses of shadow, his legs crossed, his cheek in his hand, an empty pipe in the corner of his mouth. It seemed hours before he attempted to turn his face. At the very moment the match went out, and he disappeared, overwhelmed by the shadows, as if the walls and roof of the desolate house had collapsed upon his white head in ghostly silence. Nostromo heard him stir, and uttered dispassionately the words, "It may have been a vision." "No," he said softly. "It is no vision, old man." A strong chest voice asked in the dark, "Is that you I hear, Giovanni Battista?" "Si, viejo. Steady. Not so loud." After his release by Sotillo, Giorgio Viola, attended to the very door by the good-natured engineer in chief, had re-entered his house, which he had been made to leave almost at the very moment of his wife's death. All was still. The lamp above was burning. He nearly called out to her by name, and the thought that no call from him would ever again evoke the answer of her voice made him drop heavily into the chair with a loud groan, wrung out by the pain, as of a keen blade piercing his breast. The rest of the night he made no sound. The darkness turned to grey, and on the colourless, clear, glassy dawn the jagged Sierra stood out flat and opaque as if cut out of paper. The enthusiastic and severe soul of Giorgio Viola, sailor, champion of oppressed humanity, enemy of kings, and, by the grace of Mrs. Gould, hotel keeper of the Sulaco harbour, had descended into the open abyss of desolation amongst the shattered vestiges of his past. He remembered his wooing between two campaigns, a single short week in the season of gathering olives. Nothing approached the grave passion of that time but the deep, passionate sense of his bereavement. He discovered all the extent of his dependence upon the silenced voice of that woman. It was her voice that he missed. Abstracted, busy, lost in inward contemplation, he seldom looked at his wife in those later years. The thought of his girls was a matter of concern, not of consolation. It was her voice that he would miss. And he remembered the other child, the little boy who died at sea. Ah! A man would have been something to lean upon, and alas! Even Gian' Battista, he of whom and of Linda his wife had spoken to him so anxiously before she dropped off into her last sleep on earth, he on whom she had called aloud to save the children just before she died, even he was dead. And the old man, bent forward, his head in his hand, sat through the day in immobility and solitude. He never heard the brazen roar of the bells in town. When it ceased, the earthenware filter in the corner of the kitchen kept on its swift musical drip, drip into the great porous jar below. Towards sunset he got up and with slow movements disappeared up the narrow staircase. His bulk filled it, and the rubbing of his shoulders made a small noise as of a mouse running behind the plaster of a wall. While he remained up there the house was as dumb as a grave. Then with the same faint rubbing noise he descended. He had to catch at the chairs and tables to regain his seat. He seized his pipe off the high mantel of the fireplace, but made no attempt to reach the tobacco, thrust it empty into the corner of his mouth, and sat down again in the same staring pose. The son of Pedrito's entry into Sulaco, the last son of Senor Hirsch's life, the first of Decoud's solitude on the Great Isabel, passed over the Albergo de Taglio Una on its way to the west. The tinkling drip, drip of the filter had ceased. The lamp upstairs had burned itself out, and the night beset Giorgio Viola and his dead wife with its obscurity and silence that seemed invincible, till the capataz de cargadores, returning from the dead, put them to flight with the splutter and flare of a match. "Si, viejo. It is me. Wait." Nostromo, after barricading the door and closing the shutters carefully, groped upon a shelf for a candle, and lit it. Old Viola had risen. He followed with his eyes in the dark the sounds made by Nostromo. The light disclosed him standing without support, as if the mere presence of that man who was loyal, brave, incorruptible, who was all his son would have been, were enough for the support of his decaying strength. He extended his hand, grasping the briarwood pipe, whose bowl was charred on the edge, and knitted his bushy eyebrows heavily at the light. "You have returned," he said, with shaky dignity. "Ah, very well. I " He broke off. Nostromo, leaning back against the table, his arms folded on his breast, nodded at him slightly. "You thought I was drowned? No. The best dog of the rich, of the aristocrats, of these fine men who can only talk and betray the people, is not dead yet." The Garibaldino, motionless, seemed to drink in the sound of the well-known voice. His head moved slightly once as if in sign of approval, but Nostromo saw clearly that the old man understood nothing of the words. There was no one to understand, no one he could take into the confidence of Decoud's fate, of his own, into the secret of the silver. That doctor was an enemy of the people, a tempter. Old Giorgio's heavy frame shook from head to foot with the effort to overcome his emotion at the sight of that man, who had shared the intimacies of his domestic life as though he had been a grown-up son. "She believed you would return," he said solemnly. Nostromo raised his head. "She was a wise woman. How could I fail to come back?" He finished the thought mentally. "Since she has prophesied for me an end of poverty, misery, and starvation."
These words of Teresa's anger, from the circumstances in which they had been uttered, like the cry of a soul prevented from making its peace with God, stirred the obscure superstition of personal fortune, from which even the greatest genius amongst men of adventure and action is seldom free. They reigned over Nostromo's mind with the force of a potent malediction. And what a curse it was, that which her words had laid upon him! He had been orphaned so young that he could remember no other woman whom he called mother. Henceforth there would be no enterprise in which he would not fail. The spell was working already. Death itself would elude him now. He said violently, "Come, viejo, get me something to eat. I am hungry. Sangre de Dios, the emptiness of my belly makes me light-headed." With his chin dropped again under his bare breast, above his folded arms, barefooted, watching from under a gloomy brow the movements of old Viola foraging amongst the cupboards, he seemed as if indeed fallen under a curse, a ruined and sinister capataz. Old Viola walked out of a dark corner, and without a word emptied upon the table out of his hollowed palms a few dry crusts of bread and half a raw onion, while the capataz began to devour this beggar's fare, taking up with stony-eyed voracity piece after piece lying by his side. The Garibaldino went off, and squatting down in another corner filled an earthenware mug with red wine out of a wicker-covered demijohn. With a familiar gesture, as when serving customers in the cafe, he had thrust his pipe between his teeth to have his hands free. The capataz drank greedily. A slight flush deepened the bronze of his cheek. Before him, Viola, with a turn of his white and massive head towards the staircase, took his empty pipe out of his mouth and pronounced slowly, "After the shot was fired down here, which killed her as surely as if the bullet had struck her oppressed heart, she called upon you to save the children." "Upon you, Gian' Battista." The capataz looked up. "Did she do that, padrone? To save the children? They are with the English senora, their rich benefactress. Hey, old man of the people, thy benefactress." "I am old," muttered Giorgio Viola. "An English woman was allowed to give a bed to Garibaldi, lying wounded in prison. The greatest man that ever lived. A man of the people, too. A sailor. I may let another keep a roof over my head. See, I am old. I may let her. Life lasts too long sometimes. And she herself may not have a roof over her head before many days are out, unless I... What do you say? Am I to keep a roof over her head? Am I to try and save all the Blancos together with her?" "You shall do it," said old Viola in a strong voice. "You shall do it as my son would have. Thy son, viejo. There never has been a man like thy son. I must try. But what if it were only a part of the curse to lure me on? And so she called upon me to save... and then..." She spoke no more. The heroic follower of Garibaldi, at the thought of the eternal stillness and silence fallen upon the shrouded form stretched out on the bed upstairs, averted his face and raised his hand to his furrowed brow. "She was dead before I could seize her hands," he stammered out pitifully. Before the wide eyes of the capataz, staring at the doorway of the dark staircase, floated the shape of the Great Isabel, like a strange ship in distress, freighted with enormous wealth and the solitary life of a man. It was impossible for him to do anything. He could only hold his tongue, since there was no one to trust. The treasure would be lost, probably, unless Decoud... And his thought came abruptly to an end. He perceived that he could not imagine in the least what Decoud was likely to do. Old Viola had not stirred, and the motionless capataz dropped his long soft eyelashes, which gave to the upper part of his fierce black whiskered face a touch of feminine ingenuousness. The silence had lasted for a long time. "God rest her soul," he murmured gloomily. End of Chapter 9, Part 2.
Chapter 10 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Rousel. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse. Chapter 10, Part 1. The next day was quiet in the morning, except for the faint sound of firing to the northward, in the direction of Los Hatos. Captain Mitchell had listened to it from his balcony anxiously. The phrase, "In my delicate position as the only consular agent then in the port, everything, sir, everything was a just cause for anxiety," had its place in the more or less stereotyped relation of the, "historical events," which for the next few years was at the service of distinguished strangers visiting Sulaco. The mention of the dignity and neutrality of the flag, so difficult to preserve in his position, Right in the thick of these events, between the lawlessness of the piratical villain Sotillo and the more regularly established but scarcely less atrocious tyranny of His Excellency Don Pedro Montero, came next in order. Captain Mitchell was not the man to enlarge upon mere dangers much, but he insisted that it was a memorable day. On that day, towards dusk, he had seen "that poor fellow of mine, Nostromo, the sailor whom I discovered and, I may say, made, sir. The man of the famous ride to Cayta, sir. An historical event, sir." Regarded by the O.S.N. Company as an old and faithful servant, Captain Mitchell was allowed to attain the term of his usefulness in ease and dignity at the head of the enormously extended service. The augmentation of the establishment, with its crowds of clerks, an office in town, the old office in the harbour, the division into departments, passenger, cargo, lighterage, and so on, secured a greater leisure for his last years in the regenerated Sulaco, the capital of the Occidental Republic. Liked by the natives for his good nature and the formality of his manner, self-important and simple, known for years as a "friend of our country," he felt himself a personality of mark in the town. Getting up early for a turn in the market-place while the gigantic shadow of Higuerota was still lying upon the fruit and flower stalls piled up with masses of gorgeous colouring, attending easily to current affairs, welcomed in houses, greeted by ladies on the Alameda, with his entry into all the clubs and a footing in the Casa Gould, he led his privileged old bachelor, man-about-town existence with great comfort and solemnity. But on mail-boat days he was down at the harbour office at an early hour, with his own gig, manned by a smart crew in white and blue, ready to dash off and board the ship directly she showed her bows between the harbour heads. It would be into the harbour office that he would lead some privileged passenger he had brought off in his own boat, and invite him to take a seat for a moment while he signed a few papers, and Captain Mitchell, seating himself at his desk, would keep on talking hospitably. "There isn't much time if you are to see everything in a day. We shall be off in a moment. We'll have lunch at the Amarilla Club, though I belong also to the Anglo-American. Mining engineers and businessmen, don't you know? And to the Mirliflores as well, a new club. English, French, Italians, all sorts. Lively young fellows mostly, who wanted to pay a compliment to an old resident, sir. But we'll lunch at the Amarilla. Interest you, I fancy. Real thing of the country. Men of the first families. The President of the Occidental Republic himself belongs to it, sir. Fine old bishop with a broken nose in the patio. A remarkable piece of statuary, I believe. Cavaliere Parochetti. You know, Parochetti, the famous Italian sculptor, was working here for 2 years. Thought very highly of our old bishop. There, I am very much at your service now." Proud of his experience, penetrated by the sense of historical importance of men, events, and buildings, he talked pompously in jerky periods, with slight sweeps of his short, thick arm, letting nothing escape the attention of his privileged captive. "Lot of building going on, as you observe. Before the separation it was a plain of burnt grass smothered in clouds of dust, with an ox cart tracked to our jetty. Nothing more. This is the harbour gate. Picturesque, is it not? Formerly the town stopped short here. We enter now the Canal de la Constitucion. Observe the old Spanish houses. Great dignity. Eh? I suppose it's just as it was in the time of the viceroys, except for the pavement. Wood blocks now. Sulaco National Bank there, with the sentry boxes each side of the gate. Casa Avellanos this side, with all the ground floor windows shuttered. A wonderful woman lives there. Miss Avellanos, the beautiful Antonia. A character, sir. A historical woman. Opposite, Casa Gould. Noble gateway. Yes, the Goulds of the original Gould concession, that all the world knows of now. I hold 17 of the $1,000 shares in the consolidated San Tome mines. All the poor savings of my lifetime, sir, and it will be enough to keep me in comfort to the end of my days at home when I retire. I got in on the ground floor, you see. Don Carlos, great friend of mine. 17 shares, quite a little fortune to leave behind one, too. I have a niece. Married a parson. Most worthy man, incumbent of a small parish in Sussex. No end of children. I was never married myself. A sailor should exercise self-denial. Standing under that very gateway, sir, with some young engineer fellows, ready to defend that house where we had received so much kindness and hospitality, I saw the first and last charge of Pedrito's horsemen upon Barrio's troops, who had just taken the harbour gate. They could not stand the new rifles brought out by that poor Decoud. It was a murderous fire. In a moment the street became blocked with a mass of dead men and horses. They never came on again. And all day Captain Mitchell would talk like this to his more or less willing victim. The plaza! I call it magnificent. Twice the area of Trafalgar Square. From the very centre, in the blazing sunshine, he pointed out the buildings. The Intendencia, now the President's Palace. Cabildo, where the lower chamber of Parliament sits. You notice the new houses on that side of the plaza? Compagnia Anzani, a great general store, like those cooperative things at home. Old Anzani was murdered by the National Guards in front of his safe. It was even for that specific crime that the deputy Gamacho, commanding the Nationals, a bloodthirsty and savage brute, was executed publicly by garrote upon the sentence of a court-martial ordered by Barrios. Anzani's nephews converted the business into a company. All that side of the Plaza had been burnt. Used to be colonnaded before. A terrible fire, by the light of which I saw the last of the fighting, the llaneros flying, the Nationals throwing their arms down, and the miners of the San Tome, all Indians from the Sierra, rolling by like a torrent to the sound of pipes and cymbals, green flags flying, a wild mass of men in white ponchos and green hats, on foot, on mules, on donkeys. Such a sight, sir, will never be seen again. The miners, sir, had marched upon the town. Don Pepe leading on his black horse, and their very wives in the rear on burros, screaming encouragement, sir, and beating tambourines. I remember one of these women had a green parrot seated on her shoulder, as calm as a bird of stone. They had just saved their Senor Administrador, for Barrios, though he ordered the assault at once, at night too, would have been too late. Padrito Montero had Don Carlos led out to be shot, like his uncle many years ago, and then, as Barrios said afterwards, Sulaco would not have been worth fighting for. Sulaco without the concession was nothing, and there were tons and tons of dynamite distributed all over the mountain with detonators arranged, and an old priest, Father Roman, standing by to annihilate the San Tome mine at the first news of failure. Don Carlos had made up his mind not to leave it behind, and he had the right men to see to it, too. Thus Captain Mitchell would talk in the middle of the plaza, holding over his head a white umbrella with green lining. But inside the cathedral, in the dim light, with a faint scent of incense floating in the cool atmosphere, and here and there a kneeling female figure, black or all white, with a veiled head, his lowered voice became solemn and impressive. "Here," he would say, pointing to a niche in the wall of the dusky aisle, "you see a bust of the Don Jose Avellanos, patriot and statesman, as the inscription says, minister to courts of England and Spain, etc., etc., died in the woods of Los Hatos, worn out with his lifelong struggle for right and justice at the dawn of a new era. A fair likeness. Parrochetti's work from some old photographs and a pencil sketch by Mrs. Gould. I was well acquainted with that distinguished Spanish-American of the old school, a true hidalgo, beloved by everyone who knew him. The marble medallion in the wall, in the antique style, representing a veiled woman seated with her hands clasped loosely over her knees, commemorates that unfortunate young gentleman who sailed out with Nostromo on that fatal night, sir. See, to the memory of Martin Decoud, his betrothed Antonia Avellanos. Frank, simple, noble. There you have that lady, sir, as she is. An exceptional woman. Those who thought she would give way to despair were mistaken, sir. She has been blamed in many quarters for not having taken the veil. It was expected of her. But Dona Antonia is not the stuff they make nuns of. Bishop Corbelin, her uncle, lives with her in the Corbelin town-house. He is a fierce sort of priest, everlastingly worrying the government about the old church lands and convents. I believe they think a lot of him in Rome. Now let us go to the Amarilla Club, just across the plaza, to get some lunch." Directly outside the cathedral, on the very top of the noble flight of steps, his voice rose pompously, his arm found again its sweeping gesture. "Porvenir, over there on that first floor, above those French plate-glass shop fronts, our biggest daily. Conservative, or rather I should say parliamentary. We have the parliamentary party here, of which the actual chief of the state, Don Juste Lopez, is the head. A very sagacious man, I think. A first-rate intellect, sir. The Democratic party in opposition rests mostly, I am sorry to say, on these socialistic Italians, sir, with their secret societies, camorras, and such like. There are lots of Italians settled here on the railway lands, dismissed navvies, mechanics, and so on, all along the trunk line. There are whole villages of Italians on the Campo. And the natives, too, are being drawn into these ways. American bar? Yes, and over there you can see another. New Yorkers mostly frequent that one. Here we are at the Amarilla. Observe the bishop at the foot of the stairs to the right as we go in." And the lunch would begin and terminate its lavish and leisurely course at a little table in the gallery, Captain Mitchell nodding, bowing, getting up to speak for a moment to different officials in black clothes, merchants in jackets, officers in uniform, middle-aged caballeros from the Campo, sallow, little, nervous men, and fat, placid, swarthy men, and Europeans or North Americans of superior standing, whose faces looked very white amongst the majority of dark complexions and black, glistening eyes. Captain Mitchell would lie back in the chair, casting around looks of satisfaction, and tender over the table a case full of thick cigars. "Try a weed with your coffee. Local tobacco. The black coffee you get at the Amarilla, sir, you won't meet anywhere in the world. We get the bean from a famous cafeteria in the foothills, whose owner sends 3 sacks every year as a present to his fellow members in remembrance of the fight against Camacho's Nationals, carried on from these very windows by the caballeros. He was in town at the time, and took part, sir, to the bitter end. It arrives on 3 mules, not in the common way, by rail. No fear. right into the patio, escorted by mounted peons, in charge of the mayoral of his estate, who walks upstairs, booted and spurred, and delivers it to our committee formally with the words, "For the sake of those fallen on the 3rd of May, we call it Tres de Mayo coffee. Taste it." Captain Mitchell, with an expression as though making ready to hear a sermon in a church, would lift the tiny cup to his lips, and the nectar would be sipped to the bottom during a restful silence in a cloud of cigar smoke. "Look at this man in black just going out," he would begin, leaning forward hastily. "This is the famous Hernandez, Minister of War. The Times special correspondent who wrote that striking series of letters calling the Occidental Republic the treasure house of the world, gave a whole article to him and the force he has organized. The renowned Carabineers of the Campo." Captain Mitchell's guest, staring curiously, would see a figure in a long-tailed black coat walking gravely, with downcast eyelids and a long, composed face, a brow furrowed horizontally, a pointed head, whose grey hair, thin at the top, combed down carefully on all sides and rolled at the ends, fell low on the neck and shoulders. This, then, was the famous bandit of whom Europe had heard with interest. He put on a high-crowned sombrero with a wide, flat brim. A rosary of wooden beads was twisted about his right wrist, and Captain Mitchell would proceed. The protector of the Sulaco refugees from the rage of Pedrito. As general of cavalry with Barrios, he distinguished himself at the storming of Tonoro, where Senor Fuentes was killed with the last remnant of the Monterists. He is the friend and humble servant of Bishop Corbelan. Hears 3 masses every day. I bet you he will step into the cathedral to say a prayer or two on his way home to his siesta." He took several puffs on his cigar in silence. Then, in his most important manner, pronounced, "The Spanish race, sir, is prolific of remarkable characters in every rank of life. I propose we go now into the billiard room, which is cool, for a quiet chat. There is never anyone there till after 5. I could tell you episodes of the Separationist Revolution that would astonish you. When the great heat's over, we'll take a turn on the Alameda." The programme went on relentless, like a law of nature. The turn on the Alameda was taken with slow steps and stately remarks. "All the great world of Sulaco here, sir." Captain Mitchell bowed right and left with no end of formality. Then, with animation, "Dona Emilia, Mrs. Gould's carriage. Look! Always white mules. The kindest, most gracious woman the sun ever shone upon. A great position, sir. A great position. First lady in Sulaco. Far before the President's wife, and worthy of it." He took off his hat; then, with a studied change of tone, added, negligently, that the man in black by her side, with a high white collar and a scarred, snarly face, was Dr. Monygham, Inspector of State Hospitals, Chief Medical Officer of the Consolidated San Tome Mines. A familiar of the house, everlastingly there. No wonder. The Goulds made him. Very clever man and all that, but I never liked him. Nobody does. I can recollect him limping about the streets in a check shirt and native sandals with a watermelon under his arm. All he would get to eat for the day. A bigwig now, sir, and as nasty as ever. However, there's no doubt he played his part fairly well at the time. He saved us all from the deadly incubus of Sotillo, where a more particular man might have failed." His arm went up. "The equestrian statue that used to stand on the pedestal over there has been removed. It was an anachronism," Captain Mitchell commented, obscurely. "There is some talk of replacing it by a marble shaft commemorative of separation, with angels of peace at the 4 corners, and bronze justice holding an even balance, all gilt, on the top. Cavaliere Parrochetti was asked to make a design, which you can see framed under glass in the municipal sala. Names are to be engraved all round the base. Well! They could do no better than begin with the name of Nostromo. He has done for separation as much as anybody else, and," added Captain Mitchell, "has got less than many others by it, when it comes to that." He dropped on to a stone seat, under a tree, and tapped invitingly at the place by his side. He carried to Barrios the letters from Sulaco which decided the General to abandon Cayta for a time, and come back to help here by sea. The transports were still in harbour, fortunately. "Sir, I did not even know that my capataz de cargadores was alive. I had no idea. It was Dr. Monygham who came upon him by chance in the custom house, evacuated an hour or 2 before by the wretched Sotillo. I was never told, never given a hint, nothing, as if I were unworthy of confidence. Monygham arranged it all. He went to the railway yards and got admission to the engineer-in-chief, who, for the sake of the Goulds as much as for anything else, consented to let an engine make a dash down the line, 180 miles, with Nostromo aboard. It was the only way to get him off. In the construction camp at the railhead, he obtained a horse, arms, some clothing, and started alone on that marvellous ride, 400 miles in 6 days through a disturbed country, ending by the feat of passing through the Monterist lines outside Cayta. The history of that ride, sir, would make a most exciting book. He carried all our lives in his pocket. Devotion, courage, fidelity, intelligence were not enough. Of course, he was perfectly fearless and incorruptible. But a man was wanted that would know how to succeed. He was that man, sir. On the 5th of May, being practically a prisoner in the harbour office of my company, I suddenly heard the whistle of an engine in the railway yards, a quarter of a mile away. I could not believe my ears. I made one jump onto the balcony, and beheld a locomotive under a great head of steam run out of the yard gates, screeching like mad, enveloped in a white cloud, and then, just abreast of old Viola's inn, check almost to a standstill. I made out, sir, a man, I couldn't tell who, dash out of the Albergo d'Italiana Una, climb into the cab, and then, sir, that engine seemed positively to leap clear of the house, and then was gone in the twinkling of an eye, as you blow a candle out, sir. There was a first-rate driver on the footplate, sir, I can tell you. They were fired heavily upon by the National Guards in Rincon and one other place. Fortunately, the line had not been torn up. In 4 hours they reached the construction camp. Nostromo had his start. The rest you know. You've only got to look around you. There are people on this Alameda that ride in their carriages, or are even alive at all today, because years ago I engaged a runaway Italian sailor for a foreman of our wharf simply on the strength of his looks, and that's a fact. You can't get over it, sir. On the 17th of May, just 12 days after I saw the man from the Casa Viola get on the engine, and wondered what it meant, Barrios's transports were entering this harbour, and the treasure house of the world, as the Times man calls Sulaco in his book, was saved intact for civilization. For a great future, sir. Pedrito, with Hernandez on the west and the San Tome miners pressing on the land gate, was not able to oppose the landing. He had been sending messages to Sotillo for a week to join him. Had Sotillo done so, there would have been massacres and proscription that would have left no man or woman of position alive. But that's where Dr. Monygham comes in. Sotillo, blind and deaf to everything, stuck on board his steamer watching the dragging for silver, which he believed to be sunk at the bottom of the harbour. They say that for the last 3 days he was out of his mind, raving and foaming with disappointment at getting nothing, flying about the deck, and yelling curses at the boats with the drags, ordering them in, and then suddenly stamping his foot and crying out, "And yet it is there! I see it! I feel it!" He was preparing to hang Dr. Monygham, whom he had on board, at the end of the after derrick, when the first of Barrios's transports, one of our own ships at that, steamed right in, and ranging close alongside, opened a small-arm fire without as much preliminaries as a hail. It was the completest surprise in the world, sir. They were too astounded at first to bolt below. Men were falling right and left like ninepins. It's a miracle that Monygham, standing on the after hatch with the rope already round his neck, escaped being riddled through and through like a sieve. He told me since that he had given himself up for lost, and kept on yelling with all the strength of his lungs, "Hoist a white flag! Hoist a white flag!" Suddenly an old major of the Esmeralda regiment, standing by, unsheathed his sword with a shriek, "Die, perjured traitor!" and ran Sotillo clean through his body, just before he fell himself shot through the head. Captain Mitchell stopped for a while. "Begad, sir, I could spin you a yarn for hours, but it's time we started off to Rincon. It would not do for you to pass through Sulaco and not see the lights of the San Tome mine, a whole mountain ablaze like a lighted palace above the dark campo. It's a fashionable drive. But let me tell you one little anecdote, sir, just to show you. A fortnight or more later, when Barrios, declared Generalissimo, was in pursuit of Pedrito away south, when the Provincial Junta, with Don Justo Lopez at its head, had promulgated the new constitution, and our Don Carlos Gould was packing up his trunks bound on a mission to San Francisco and Washington, the United States, sir, were the first great power to recognize the Occidental Republic. A fortnight later, I say, when we were beginning to feel that our heads were safe on our shoulders, if I may express myself so, a prominent man, a large shipper by our line, came to see me on business, and, says he, the first thing, "I say, Captain Mitchell, is that fellow," meaning Nostromo, "still the capataz of your cargadores or not?" "What's the matter?" says I. "Because, if he is, then I don't mind. I send and receive a good lot of cargo by your ships. But I have observed him several days loafing about the wharf, and just now he stopped me cool as you please, with a request for a cigar. Now, you know, my cigars are rather special, and I can't get them so easily as all that. I hope you stretch the point," I said, very gently. "Why, yes. But it's a confounded nuisance. The fellow's everlastingly cadging for smokes." Sir, I turned my eyes away, and then asked, "Weren't you one of those prisoners in the Cabildo?" "You know very well I was, and in chains too," says he. "And under fine of $15,000? He coloured, sir, because it got about that he fainted from fright when they came to arrest him, and then behaved before Fuentes in a manner to make the very policianos, who had dragged him there by the hair of his head, smile at his cringing. 'Yes,' he says, in a sort of shy way. 'Why?' 'Oh, nothing. You stood to lose a tidy bit,' says I, 'even if you saved your life. But what can I do for you?' He never saw the point. Not he. And that's how the world wags, sir." He rose a little stiffly, and the drive to Rincon would be taken with only one philosophical remark, uttered by the merciless Cicerone, with the eyes fixed upon the lights of San Tome, that seemed suspended in the dark night between earth and heaven. A great power this, for good and evil, sir. A great power. End of Part Third, The Lighthouse. Chapter 10, Part 1. Chapter 10 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Rousel. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part Third, The Lighthouse. Chapter 10, Part 2. And the dinner of the Mirliflores would be eaten, excellent as to cooking, and leaving upon the traveller's mind an impression that there were in Sulaco many pleasant, able young men with salaries apparently too large for their discretion, and amongst them a few, mostly Anglo-Saxon, skilled in the art of, as the saying is, taking a rise out of his kind host. With a rapid, jingling drive to the harbour in a two-wheeled machine, which Captain Mitchell called a curricle, behind a fleet and scraggy mule beaten all the time by an obviously Neapolitan driver, the cycle would be nearly closed before the lighted-up offices of the O.S.N. Company, remaining open so late because of the steamer. Nearly, but not quite. 10 o'clock. Your ship won't be ready to leave till 12:30, if by then. Come in for a brandy and soda and one more cigar. And in the superintendent's private room the privileged passenger by the Ceres, or Juno, or Pallas, stunned and as it were annihilated mentally by a sudden surfeit of sights, sounds, names, facts, and complicated information imperfectly apprehended, would listen like a tired child to a fairy tale, would hear a voice, familiar and surprising in its pompousness, tell him, as if from another world, how there was, in this very harbour, an international naval demonstration, which put an end to the Costaguana-Sulaco war, how the United States cruiser, Powhatan, was the first to salute the Occidental flag, white, with a wreath of green laurel in the middle encircling a yellow amarilla flower, would hear how General Montero, in less than a month after proclaiming himself Emperor of Costaguana, was shot dead, during a solemn and public distribution of orders and crosses, by a young artillery officer, the brother of his then mistress. The abominable Pedrito, sir, fled the country, the voice would say. And it would continue. A captain of one of our ships told me lately that he recognized Pedrito the Guerrillero, arrayed in purple slippers and a velvet smoking cap with a gold tassel, keeping a disorderly house in one of the southern ports. Abominable Pedrito! Who the devil was he? Would wonder the distinguished bird of passage, hovering on the confines of waking and sleep, with resolutely open eyes and a faint but amiable curl upon his lips, from between which stuck out the 18th or 20th cigar of that memorable day. He appeared to me in this very room like a haunting ghost, sir. Captain Mitchell was talking of his Nostromo with true warmth of feeling and a touch of wistful pride. You may imagine, sir, what an effect it produced on me. He had come round by sea with Barrios, of course, and the first thing he told me after I became fit to hear him was that he had picked up the lighter's boat floating in the gulf. He seemed quite overcome by the circumstance, and a remarkable enough circumstance it was, when you remember that it was 16 days since the sinking of the Silver. At once I could see he was another man. He stared at the wall, sir, as if there had been a spider or something running about there. The loss of the Silver preyed on his mind. The first thing he asked me about was whether Dona Antonia had heard yet of Decoud's death. His voice trembled. I had to tell him Dona Antonia, as a matter of fact, was not back in town yet. Poor girl! And just as I was ready to ask him 1,000 questions, with a sudden "Pardon me, senor," he cleared out of the office altogether. I did not see him again for 3 days. I was terribly busy, you know. It seems that he wandered about, in and out of town, and on 2 nights turned up to sleep in the barracoons of the railway people. He seemed absolutely indifferent to what went on. I asked him on the wharf, "When are you going to take hold again, Nostromo? There will be plenty of work for the cargadores presently." "Senor," says he, looking at me in a slow, inquisitive manner, "would it surprise you to hear that I am too tired to work just yet? And what work could I do now? How can I look my cargadores in the face after losing a lighter?" I begged him not to think any more about the Silver, and he smiled. A smile that went to my heart, sir. It was no mistake, I told him. It was a fatality. A thing that could not be helped. "Si, si," he said, and turned away. I thought it best to leave him alone for a bit to get over it. Sir, it took him years, really, to get over it. I was present at his interview with Don Carlos. I must say that Gould is a rather cold man. He had to keep a tight hand on his feelings, dealing with thieves and rascals, in constant danger of ruin for himself and wife for so many years, that it had become a second nature. They looked at each other for a long time. Don Carlos asked what he could do for him, in his quiet, reserved way. "My name is known from one end of Sulaco to the other," he said, as quiet as the other. "What more can you do for me?" That was all that passed on that occasion. Later, however, there was a very fine coasting schooner for sale, and Mrs. Gould and I put our heads together to get her bought and presented to him. It was done, but he paid all the price back within the next 3 years. Business was booming all along the seaboard, sir. Moreover, that man always succeeded in everything except in saving the silver. Poor Dona Antonia, fresh from her terrible experiences in the wood of Los Hatos, had an interview with him too. Wanted to hear about Decoud, what they said, what they did, what they thought up to the last on that fatal night. Mrs. Gould told me his manner was perfect for quietness and sympathy. Miss Avellanos burst into tears only when he told her how Decoud had happened to say that his plan would be a glorious success. And there's no doubt, sir, that it is. It is a success. The cycle was about to close at last, and while the privileged passenger, shivering with the pleasant anticipations of his berth, forgot to ask himself, what on earth Decoud's plan could be, Captain Mitchell was saying, "Sorry we must part so soon. Your intelligent interest made this a pleasant day to me. I shall see you now on board. You had a glimpse of the treasure house of the world. A very good name that." And the coxswain's voice at the door, announcing that the gig was ready, closed the cycle. Nostromo had, indeed, found the lighter's boat, which he had left on the Great Isabel with Decoud, floating empty far out in the gulf. He was then on the bridge of the first of Barrios's transports, and within an hour's steaming from Sulaco. Barrios, always delighted with a feat of daring and a good judge of courage, had taken a great liking to the capataz. During the passage round the coast the General kept Nostromo near his person, addressing him frequently in that abrupt and boisterous manner which was the sign of his high favour. Nostromo's eyes were the first to catch, broad on the bow, the tiny, elusive dark speck, which, along with the forms of the three Isabels right ahead, appeared on the flat, shimmering emptiness of the gulf. There are times when no fact should be neglected as insignificant. A small boat so far from the land might have had some meaning worth finding out. At a nod of consent from Barrios the transport swept out of her course, passing near enough to ascertain that no one manned the little cockle-shell. It was merely a common small boat gone adrift with her oars in her. But Nostromo, to whose mind Decoud had been insistently present for days, had long before recognized with excitement the dinghy of the lighter. There could be no question of stopping to pick up that thing. Every minute of time was momentous with the lives and futures of a whole town. The head of the leading ship, with the general on board, fell off to her course. Behind her the fleet of transports, scattered haphazard over a mile or so in the offing, like a finish line of an ocean race, pressed on, all black and smoking in the western sky. "Mi general," Nostromo's voice rang out loud, but quiet, from behind a group of officers. "I should like to save that little boat. Por Dios, I know her. She belongs to my company." "And por Dios," guffawed Barrios in a noisy, good-humoured voice, "you belong to me. I am going to make you a captain of cavalry directly we get within sight of a horse again." "I can swim far better than I can ride, mi general," cried Nostromo, pushing through to the rail with a set stare in his eyes. "Let me—" "Let you? What a conceited fellow that is!" bantered the General, jovially, without even looking at him. "Let him go? He wants me to admit that we cannot take Sulaco without him. Would you like to swim off to her, my son?" Nostromo had leapt overboard, and his black head bobbed up far away already from the ship. The General muttered an appalled "Cielo! Sinner that I am!" in a thunderstruck tone. One anxious glance was enough to show that Nostromo was swimming with perfect ease, and then he thundered terribly, "No, no! We shall not stop to pick up this impertinent fellow. Let him drown, that mad capataz." Nothing short of main force would have kept Nostromo from leaping overboard. That empty boat, coming out to meet him mysteriously, as if rowed by an invisible spectre, exercised the fascination of some sign, of some warning, seemed to answer in a startling and enigmatic way the persistent thought of a treasure and of a man's fate. He would have leapt if there had been death in that half-mile of water. It was as smooth as a pond, and for some reason sharks are unknown in the placid gulf, though on the other side of the Punta Mala the coastline swarms with them. The capataz seized hold of the stern and blew with force. A queer, faint feeling had come over him while he swam. He had got rid of his boots and coat in the water. He hung on for a time, regaining his breath. In the distance the transports, more in a bunch now, held on straight for Sulaco, with their air of friendly contest, of nautical sport, of a regatta, and the united smoke of their funnels drove like a thin, sulphurous fog bank right over his head. It was his daring, his courage, his act, that had set these ships in motion upon the sea, hurrying on to save the lives and fortunes of the Blancos, the taskmasters of the people, to save the San Tome mine, to save the children. With a vigorous and skilful effort he clambered over the stern. The very boat, no doubt of it, no doubt whatsoever. It was the dinghy of the lighter number 3. The dinghy left with Martin Decoud on the Great Isabel so that he should have some means to help himself if nothing could be done for him from the shore. And here she had come out to meet him, empty and inexplicable. What had become of Decoud? The capataz made a minute examination. He looked for some scratch, for some mark, for some sign. All he discovered was a brown stain on the gunwale abreast of the thwart. He bent his face over it and rubbed hard with his finger. Then he sat down in the stern sheets, passive, with his knees close together and legs aslant. Streaming from head to foot, with his hair and whiskers hanging lank and dripping and a lustreless stare fixed upon the bottom boards, the capataz of the Sulaco cargadores resembled a drowned corpse come up from the bottom to idle away the sunset hour in a small boat. The excitement of his adventurous ride, the excitement of the return in time, of achievement, of success, all this excitement centered round the associated ideas of the great treasure and of the only other man who knew of its existence, had departed from him. To the very last moment he had been cudgelling his brains as to how he could manage to visit the Great Isabel without loss of time and undetected. For the idea of secrecy had come to be connected with the treasure so closely that even to Barrios himself he had refrained from mentioning the existence of Decoud and of the silver on the island. The letters he carried to the General, however, made brief mention of the loss of the lighter, as having its bearing upon the situation in Sulaco. In the circumstances, the one-eyed tiger-slayer, scenting battle from afar, had not wasted his time in making inquiries from the messenger. In fact, Barrios, talking with Nostromo, assumed that both Don Martin Decoud and the ingots of the San Tome were lost together, and Nostromo, not questioned directly, had kept silent, under the influence of some indefinable form of resentment and distrust. Let Don Martin speak of everything with his own lips, was what he told himself mentally. And now, with the means of gaining the Great Isabel thrown thus in his way at the earliest possible moment, his excitement had departed, as when the soul takes flight, leaving the body inert upon an earth it knows no more. Nostromo did not seem to know the gulf. For a long time, even his eyelids did not flutter once upon the glazed emptiness of his stare. Then slowly, without a limb having stirred, without a twitch of muscle or quiver of an eyelash, an expression, a living expression came upon the still features, deep thought crept into the empty stare, as if an outcast soul, a quiet, brooding soul, finding that untenanted body in its way, had come in stealthily to take possession. The capataz frowned, and in the immense stillness of sea, islands, and coast, of cloud forms on the sky and trails of light upon the water, the knitting of that brow had the emphasis of a powerful gesture. Nothing else budged for a long time. Then the capataz shook his head, and again surrendered himself to the universal repose of all visible things. Suddenly he seized the oars, and with one movement made the dinghy spin round, head on to the Great Isabel. But before he began to pull, he bent once more over the brown stain on the gunwale. "I know that thing," he muttered to himself, with a sagacious jerk of the head. "That's blood." His stroke was long, vigorous, and steady. Now and then he looked over his shoulder at the Great Isabel, presenting its low cliff to his anxious gaze like an impenetrable face. At last the stem touched the strand. He flung rather than dragged the boat up the little beach. At once, turning his back upon the sunset, he plunged with long strides into the ravine, making the water of the stream spurt and fly upwards at every step, as if spurning its shallow, clear, murmuring spirit with his feet. He wanted to save every moment of daylight. A mass of earth, grass, and smashed bushes had fallen down very naturally from above upon the cavity under the leaning tree. Decoud had attended to the concealment of the silver as instructed, using the spade with some intelligence. But Nostromo's half-smile of approval changed into a scornful curl of the lip by the sight of the spade itself flung there in full view, as if in utter carelessness or sudden panic, giving away the whole thing. Ah, they were all alike in their folly, these hombres finos that invented laws and governments and barren tasks for the people. The capataz picked up the spade, and with the feel of the handle in his palm the desire of having a look at the horsehide boxes of treasure came upon him suddenly. In a very few strokes he uncovered the edges and corners of several. Then, clearing away more earth, became aware that one of them had been slashed with a knife. He exclaimed at that discovery in a stifled voice, and dropped on his knees with a look of irrational apprehension over one shoulder, then over the other. The stiff hide had closed, and he hesitated before he pushed his hand through the long slit and felt the ingots inside. There they were. 1, 2, 3, yes, 4 gone. Taken away. 4 ingots. But who? Decoud? Nobody else. And why? For what purpose? For what cursed fancy? Let him explain. 4 ingots carried off in a boat, and blood. In the face of the open gulf, the sun, clear, unclouded, unaltered, plunged into waters in a grave and untroubled mystery of self-immolation consummated far from all mortal eyes, with an infinite majesty of silence and peace. 4 ingots short, and blood! The capataz got up slowly. He might simply have cut his hand, he muttered, but then... He sat down on the soft earth, unresisting, as if he had been chained to the treasure, his drawn-up legs clasped in his hands with an air of hopeless submission, like a slave set on guard. Once only he lifted his head smartly. The rattle of hot musketry fire had reached his ears, like pouring from on high a stream of dry peas upon a drum. After listening for a while, he said, half aloud, "He will never come back to explain." He lowered his head again. "Impossible," he muttered gloomily. The sounds of firing died out. The loom of a great conflagration in Sulaco flashed up red above the coast, played on the clouds at the head of the gulf, seemed to touch with a ruddy and sinister reflection the forms of the three Isabels. He never saw it, though he raised his head. "But then I cannot know," he pronounced, distinctly, and remained silent and staring for hours. He could not know. Nobody was to know. As might have been supposed, the end of Don Martin Decoud never became a subject of speculation for anyone except Nostromo. Had the truth of the facts been known, there would always have remained the question, why? Whereas the version of his death at the sinking of the lighter had no uncertainty of motive. The young apostle of separation had died striving for his idea by an ever-lamented accident. But the truth was that he died from solitude, the enemy known but to few on this earth, and whom only the simplest of us are fit to withstand. The brilliant Costaguanero of the boulevards had died from solitude and want of faith in himself and others. For some good and valid reasons beyond mere human comprehension, the sea-birds of the Gulf shun the Isabels. The rocky head of Azuera is their haunt, whose stony levels and chasms resound with their wild and tumultuous clamour, as if they were forever quarrelling over the legendary treasure. At the end of his first day on the Great Isabel, Decoud, turning in his lair of coarse grass, under the shade of a tree, said to himself, "I have not seen as much as one single bird all day." And he had not heard a sound, either, all day, but that one now of his own muttering voice. It had been a day of absolute silence, the first he had known in his life. And he had not slept a wink. Not for all these wakeful nights and the days of fighting, planning, talking. Not for all that last night of danger and hard physical toil upon the gulf had he been able to close his eyes for a moment. And yet from sunrise to sunset he had been lying prone on the ground, either on his back or on his face. He stretched himself, and with slow steps descended into the gully to spend the night by the side of the silver. If Nostromo returned, as he might have done at any moment, it was there that he would look first, and night would, of course, be the proper time for an attempt to communicate. He remembered with profound indifference that he had not eaten anything since he had been left alone on the island. He spent the night open-eyed, and when the day broke he ate something with the same indifference. The brilliant Sul Decoud, the spoiled darling of the family, the lover of Antonia and journalist of Sulaco, was not fit to grapple with himself single-handed. Solitude from mere outward condition of existence becomes very swiftly a state of soul in which the affectations of irony and scepticism have no place. It takes possession of the mind, and drives forth the thought into the exile of utter unbelief. After 3 days of waiting for the sight of some human face, Decoud caught himself entertaining a doubt of his own individuality. It had merged into the world of cloud and water, of natural forces and forms of nature. In our activity alone do we find the sustaining illusion of an independent existence as against the whole scheme of things of which we form a helpless part. Decoud lost all belief in the reality of his action past and to come. On the 5th day an immense melancholy descended upon him palpably. He resolved not to give himself up to these people in Sulaco, who had beset him, unreal and terrible, like gibbering and obscene spectres. He saw himself struggling feebly in their midst, and Antonia, gigantic and lovely like an allegorical statue, looking on with scornful eyes at his weakness. Not a living being, not a speck of distant sail, appeared within the range of his vision, and as if to escape from his solitude, he absorbed himself in his melancholy. The vague consciousness of a misdirected life given up to impulses whose memory left a bitter taste in his mouth was the first moral sentiment of his manhood. But at the same time he felt no remorse. What should he regret? He had recognized no other virtue than intelligence, and had erected passions into duties. Both his intelligence and his passion were swallowed up easily in this great unbroken solitude of waiting without faith. Sleeplessness had robbed his will of all energy, for he had not slept 7 hours in the 7 days. His sadness was the sadness of a sceptical mind. He beheld the universe as a succession of incomprehensible images. Nostromo was dead. Everything had failed ignominiously. He no longer dared to think of Antonia. She had not survived. But if she survived, he could not face her. And all exertion seemed senseless. On the 10th day, after a night spent without even dozing off once, it had occurred to him that Antonia could not possibly have ever loved a being so impalpable as himself. The solitude appeared like a great void, and the silence of the gulf like a tense, thin cord to which he hung suspended by both hands, without fear, without surprise, without any sort of emotion whatever. Only towards the evening, with the comparative relief of coolness, he began to wish that this cord would snap. He imagined it snapping with a report as of a pistol, a sharp, full crack, and that would be the end of him. He contemplated that eventuality with pleasure, because he dreaded the sleepless nights in which the silence, remaining unbroken in the shape of a cord to which he hung with both hands, vibrated with senseless phrases, always the same but utterly incomprehensible, about Nostromo, Antonia, Barrios, and proclamations mingled into an ironical and senseless buzzing. In the daytime he could look at the silence like a still cord stretched to breaking point, with his life, his vain life, suspended to it like a weight. I wonder whether I would hear it snap before I fell, he asked himself. The sun was 2 hours above the horizon when he got up, gaunt, dirty, white-faced, and looked at it with his red-rimmed eyes. His limbs obeyed him slowly, as if full of lead, yet without tremor, and the effect of that physical condition gave to his movements an unhesitating, deliberate dignity. He acted as if accomplishing some sort of rite. He descended into the gully, for the fascination of all that silver, with its potential power, survived alone outside of himself. He picked up the belt with the revolver that was lying there, and buckled it round his waist. The cord of silence could never snap on the island. It must let him fall and sink into the sea, he thought. And sink! He was looking at the loose earth covering the treasure. In the sea! His aspect was that of a somnambulist. He lowered himself down on his knees slowly, and went on grubbing with his fingers with industrious patience till he uncovered one of the boxes. Without a pause, as if doing some work done many times before, he slit it open and took 4 ingots, which he put in his pockets. He covered up the exposed box again, and step by step came out of the gully. The bushes closed after him with a swish. It was on the 3rd day of his solitude that he had dragged the dinghy near the water with an idea of rowing away somewhere, but had desisted partly at the whisper of lingering hope that Nostromo would return, partly from conviction of utter uselessness of all effort. Now she wanted only a slight shove to be set afloat. He had eaten a little every day after the first, and had some muscular strength left yet. Taking up the oars slowly, he pulled away from the cliff of the Great Isabel that stood behind him, warm with sunshine, as if with the heat of life, bathed in a rich light from head to foot, as if in a radiance of hope and joy. He pulled straight towards the setting sun. When the gulf had grown dark, he ceased rowing and flung the sculls in. The hollow clatter they made in falling was the loudest noise he had ever heard in his life. It was a revelation. It seemed to recall him from far away. Actually the thought, "Perhaps I may sleep tonight," passed through his mind. But he did not believe it. He believed in nothing. And he remained sitting on the thwart. The dawn from behind the mountains put a gleam into his unwinking eyes. After a clear daybreak the sun appeared splendidly above the peaks of the range. The great gulf burst into a glitter all around the boat, and in this glory of merciless solitude the silence appeared again before him, stretched taut like a dark, thin string. His eyes looked at it while, without haste, he shifted his seat from the thwart to the gunwale. They looked at it fixedly while his hand, feeling about his waist, unbuttoned the flap of the leather case, drew the revolver, cocked it, brought it forward pointing at his breast, pulled the trigger, and, with convulsive force, sent the still smoking weapon hurtling through the air. His eyes looked at it while he fell forward and hung with his breast on the gunwale and the fingers of his right hand hooked under the thwart. They looked. "It is done," he stammered out, in a sudden flow of blood. His last thought was, "I wonder how the capataz died." The stiffness of his fingers relaxed, and the lover of Antonia Avellanos rolled overboard without having heard the cord of silence snap in the solitude of the placid gulf, whose glittering surface remained untroubled by the fall of his body. A victim of the disillusioned weariness which is the retribution meted out to intellectual audacity, the brilliant Don Martin Decoud, weighted by the bars of the San Tome silver, disappeared without a trace, swallowed up in the immense indifference of things. His sleepless, crouching figure was gone from the side of the San Tome silver, and for a time the spirits of good and evil that hover near every concealed treasure of the earth might have thought that this one had been forgotten by all mankind. Then, after a few days, another form appeared striding away from the setting sun to sit motionless and awake in the narrow black gully all through the night, in nearly the same pose, in the same place in which had sat the other sleepless man who had gone away for ever so quietly in a small boat about the time of sunset. And the spirits of good and evil that hover about a forbidden treasure understood well that the silver of San Tome was provided now with a faithful and lifelong slave. The magnificent capataz de cargadores, victim of the disenchanted vanity which is the reward of audacious action, sat in the weary pose of a hunted outcast through a night of sleeplessness as tormenting as any known to Decoud, his companion in the most desperate affair of his life. And he wondered how Decoud had died. But he knew the part he had played himself. First a woman, then a man, abandoned both in their last extremity, for the sake of this accursed treasure. It was paid for by a soul lost and by a vanished life. The blank stillness of awe was succeeded by a gust of immense pride. There was no one in the world but Giovanni Battista Fidanza, capataz de cargadores, the incorruptible and faithful Nostromo, to pay such a price. He had made up his mind that nothing should be allowed now to rob him of his bargain. Nothing. Decoud had died. But how? That he was dead he had not a shadow of a doubt. But 4 ingots? What for? Did he mean to come for more? Some other time? The treasure was putting forth its latent power. It troubled the clear mind of the man who had paid the price. He was sure that Decoud was dead. The island seemed full of that whisper. Dead. Gone. And he caught himself listening for the swish of bushes and the splash of the footfalls in the bed of the brook. Dead. The talker, the novio of Dona Antonia. Ha! He murmured with his head on his knees, under the livid, clouded dawn, breaking over the liberated Sulaco and upon the gulf as grey as ashes. It is to her that he will fly. To her that he will fly. And 4 ingots! Did he take them in revenge, to cast a spell, like the angry woman who had prophesied remorse and failure, and yet had laid upon him the task of saving the children? Well, he had saved the children. He had defeated the spell of poverty and starvation. He had done it all alone, or perhaps helped by the devil. Who cared? He had done it, betrayed as he was, and saving by the same stroke the San Tome mine, which appeared to him hateful and immense, lording it by its vast wealth over the valour, the toil, the fidelity of the poor, over war and peace, over the labours of the town, the sea, and the campo. The sun lit up the sky behind the peaks of the Cordillera. The capataz looked down for a time upon the fall of loose earth, stones, and smashed bushes, concealing the hiding place of the silver. I must grow rich very slowly, he meditated aloud. End of Part Third, The Lighthouse, Chapter 10, Part 2. Recording by Steve Rousel.